The rain fell sideways that morning, driven by a wind that smelled of turned earth and iron. I stood at the edge of the open grave and watched the mahogany lid of James's casket darken, drop by drop, as though the sky were trying to wash away what was about to become permanent. Daniel's hand was in mine. Small, damp, ferocious in its grip, 8 years old and already learning that the world could remove the floor beneath your feet without warning. He hadn't spoken since breakfast, a bowl of cereal he'd stirred into paste, sitting across from me at the kitchen table while the clock above the stove ticked through the last ordinary morning of our lives. The minister was saying something, words about grace and eternal rest and the sovereignty of a plan none of us had agreed to. I focused on the texture of the prayer card they'd handed me at the door, the edges already softening from the moisture, the photo of James printed slightly off-center. It was his faculty headshot, the one where he wore the blue tie I'd picked for him the previous Christmas. He'd laughed when I chose it, said it made him look like an insurance salesman. I told him all architects should look a little trustworthy. Now that tie was somewhere in the closet at home, folded between sweaters he'd never wear again, and I was standing in a cemetery in Westfield holding a card with his face on it, while 70 people I barely knew dabbed at their eyes with embroidered handkerchiefs. I could feel them watching me, gauging my grief, measuring whether I was performing it correctly, enough tears to be authentic, not so many that it made anyone uncomfortable, the calculus of public mourning. I gave them nothing, not because I wasn't breaking apart inside, but because the breaking was happening in a place so deep that the surface hadn't cracked yet. It would. Later, in the shower, with the water loud enough to cover the sound, in the parking lot of the grocery store, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. At 3 a.m., reaching for his side of the bed and finding only cold sheets and the faint, fading smell of sandalwood. But not here, not in front of them. Mom? Daniel tugged my hand. Is Dad cold? I looked down at him. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead. His suit, too big, borrowed from a neighbor's son, hung off his shoulders like a flag at half-mast. His eyes, James's eyes, were wide and searching and utterly, devastatingly serious. No, sweetheart, I said. He's not cold. I didn't know if that was true. I didn't know anything anymore. Not what happened next. Not how to be a mother without a co-pilot. Not how to exist in a house where every doorframe still held the ghost of his shoulder leaning against it. All I knew was that the casket was being lowered, and the earth was swallowing the only man who'd ever looked at me like I was the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. Someone pressed a rose into my hand. I dropped it into the grave. It landed on the casket's surface with a sound so soft it might have been imagined. The reception afterward was held in the church fellowship hall. Folding chairs and fluorescent lights and casseroles wrapped in aluminum foil, brought by women who meant well and men who had no idea what to say. I moved through it like smoke, present but insubstantial, shaking hands and accepting condolences and nodding at stories about James that I already knew, that I'd lived inside of, that were now being narrated back to me as though they belonged to everyone. Daniel sat in the corner with a paper plate of food he wasn't eating, watching the adults with the expression of a person who had just discovered that the world contained a kind of pain that polite conversations couldn't touch. I was pouring coffee from a stainless steel carafe, the 4th cup I wouldn't drink, when I saw Richard. He came through the side door, not the main entrance. James's older brother, immaculate even in mourning, charcoal suit, monogrammed cufflinks, hair styled in a way that suggested a man who never looked unkempt even in grief. He carried himself the way expensive cars move through traffic, smooth, deliberate, occupying more space than strictly necessary. Clara, he took both my hands. His palms were dry and cool. I am so, so sorry. His eyes were the right kind of wet. Not crying, Richard didn't cry, but glistening, enough to signal that he felt something or wanted me to believe he did. He smelled like cedar cologne and leather seats. Thank you for coming, I said, because the script demanded it. Of course. He paused, swallowed visibly. James was my brother, my best friend. That wasn't true. James had told me once, late at night with a glass of bourbon balanced on his chest, that Richard had always competed with him for their father's approval, for professional prestige, for some invisible metric of success that only Richard kept track of. But James said it with sadness, not anger. He'd wanted Richard to be happy. He'd wanted everyone to be happy. That was the kind of man who was now sealed inside a box beneath 6 feet of wet New Jersey clay. Richard squeezed my hands. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a manila envelope, the kind with a metal clasp at the top. I know this isn't the time, he said, lowering his voice to a register of calculated intimacy, but there are some estate matters we should discuss. Nothing urgent, just... When you're ready, I've put together some paperwork to make things easier for you. He pressed the envelope into my hands the way you'd hand a child a gift, gently, with expectation. I looked down at it. My name was printed on a label in the upper left corner, Clara Harrington. Below it, in smaller type, R.E. Estate of James T. Harrington. There was something in the weight of it. Something in the way Richard's fingers lingered on the envelope's edge a half-second longer than necessary, as though reluctant to release it. Something in the way his eyes flicked just once toward Daniel across the room. I didn't have a name for what I saw in his face at that moment. Not then. It would take months before I could identify it, but I filed it away, behind the grief, behind the numbness, behind the exhaustion of performing survival for an audience, in a place where instincts live. Years later, I would understand exactly what that expression was. Hunger. 2 weeks after the funeral, Richard came to my kitchen table with a pen and a smile, and the patience of a man who had rehearsed this conversation in front of a mirror. The apartment still smelled like James. Not his cologne, that had faded within days, but the deeper scent of him, the one embedded in the fibers of the couch cushions and the wool of the blanket draped over the reading chair. A smell like warm paper and coffee grounds, and something unnameable that I'd spent 12 years breathing in without cataloging. It was leaving, molecule by molecule, and I couldn't stop it. Daniel was in his room with the door cracked open. I could hear the tinny audio of a cartoon playing on the tablet James had given him for his birthday, the last birthday James would ever attend, though none of us had known that when we'd wrapped the gift in blue paper with silver stars. Richard sat across from me, his briefcase open on the table between our cups of tea. Mine was untouched and cooling. His he sipped with the deliberate pleasure of a man who appreciated small comforts, even in moments of supposed grief. I know this is overwhelming, he said. He had the tone perfected, warm, unhurried, brotherly. Estates are complicated. James had the house, the insurance policy, a small retirement account. It all needs to go through probate unless we handle it privately, and probate in this state can take 18 months. He let that number land. 18 months. 18 months of uncertainty, of legal limbo, of not knowing what was mine and what wasn't. I've had my attorney draft everything to make this as painless as possible. He slid the first document toward me. This transfers the house into a holding company I've set up, Harrington Family Holdings. It protects you from liability. If anyone sues the estate, contractors, creditors, whatever, the house is shielded. I looked at the document, 12 pages of language I didn't understand. Whereas and hereinafter, and party of the first part. It might as well have been written in another alphabet. And the insurance, I asked? Same structure, another document thicker than the first. The payout goes into the holding company, I manage the investments, and you draw a monthly stipend. Think of it as James taking care of you from, he paused, had the decency to look down at his hands, from beyond. The phrase sat between us like a stone dropped into still water. I should have asked questions. I know that now, with the clarity of a woman who spent 8 years learning exactly what those documents said, I should have asked why the holding company was in Richard's name. I should have asked why the monthly stipend was a fraction of the insurance payout's interest. I should have asked why a man who hadn't visited his brother's home in 3 years was suddenly so eager to help manage his estate. But I was 2 weeks into widowhood. I was sleeping 3 hours a night. I was feeding Daniel meals I couldn't taste, driving routes I couldn't remember, answering phone calls from people whose voices I couldn't place. Grief doesn't sharpen you. It doesn't make you vigilant. It wraps you in gauze so thick that the world becomes a series of muffled shapes and distant sounds, and you sign what the person across the table tells you to sign because fighting takes energy you've already spent on the act of getting out of bed. Richard handed me the pen. Heavy, silver, monogrammed with his initials. Just here, he said, pointing, and here, an initial at the bottom of each page. I signed. Page after page, my hand moving in the cursive of a woman named Clara Harrington who had once believed that family meant safety. The pen's weight felt authoritative, final, each signature a small door closing with a click I couldn't hear. Richard watched me sign. He didn't rush me. He didn't fidget. He sat with the stillness of a man who understood that patience, properly deployed, was more effective than force. He refilled my tea. He asked about Daniel. He mentioned a family therapist he could recommend. When I finished the last page, he gathered the documents into a neat stack, tapped their edges against the table to align them, and slid them into his briefcase with a sound like a drawer being shut. You've done the right thing, Clara, he said. James would have wanted this handled quickly, cleanly. He stood, buttoned his jacket, a single button navy that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, reached down and squeezed my shoulder with the precise pressure of a man who had studied how much contact conveyed concern without overstepping. I'll take care of everything. He walked toward the door. His shoes made no sound on the carpet, Italian leather, soft-soled, the kind of shoes that moved through the world without leaving marks. He paused at the threshold, one hand on the doorframe, turned back. Tell Danny the first said hi, he said. I'll come by next week. Maybe take him to a game or something. He never came back, but in that moment, that half second before he turned fully away, I saw it again, the thing I'd seen at the funeral. The expression that didn't match the words, that lived underneath the performance like a current beneath ice. His mouth said sympathy. His eyes were counting. Counting what, I didn't know. Not yet. But something in the oldest part of my brain, the part that predates language, that runs on instinct and the raw electricity of pattern recognition, filed a report, tagged it, shelved it in a place I wouldn't access for months until the certified letter arrived and the locks on my front door stopped working and Richard's phone rang 6 times before going to a voicemail box that was full. I washed the teacups that evening. Richard's had a lip print on the rim. I scrubbed it until the ceramic squeaked. Then I dried them both and put them away in the cabinet above the stove, next to the mug James used to drink his morning coffee from, the chipped blue one with the faded MIT logo. I stood there for a long time, staring at that mug. Somewhere down the hallway, Daniel turned off his tablet. The apartment went quiet except for the refrigerator's hum and the distant sound of a neighbor's television. I didn't know yet that I'd just signed away my home, that the holding company was a lock and Richard had both keys. That the insurance money, $650,000, the price the actuaries had placed on 12 years of James's heartbeat, was already being wired to an account I would never see. All I knew was that my tea was cold, that my son was quiet, that the pen Richard had left behind was still on the table, its silver cap catching the overhead light like something winking. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, 6 weeks after I signed Richard's documents. It came in a business envelope with a return address of a law firm I'd never heard of. Whitaker, Sloan and Associates, printed in the corner in a font designed to communicate authority without warmth. I was making Daniel's lunch. Peanut butter and banana, the crusts removed because he was 8 and believed that bread edges contained a different, inferior substance than the rest of the slice. The radio was playing something soft through the kitchen speaker, a habit James and I had maintained for years, music during meal prep, because silence in a kitchen always felt like something was missing. I opened the envelope with a butter knife. The language was dense and careful, but the meaning carved through it like a blade through wet paper. Notice of transfer, property at 14 Maple Lane, Westfield, New Jersey, held by Harrington Family Holdings, LLC. The managing partner of the LLC, Richard A. Harrington, had exercised his right under the operating agreement to liquidate the asset. The property would be vacated within 30 days. I read it twice. The second time I sat down because my legs had made a decision my brain was still processing. 30 days. This house, the one with the pencil marks on the doorframe where James measured Daniel every birthday, the one with the crack in the front step that James kept meaning to fix, the one with the kitchen window that caught the evening light in a way that turned the whole room amber. This house was no longer mine. It hadn't been mine, apparently, since the afternoon I'd sat at this same table and signed page after page while Richard poured my tea and called me brave. I called his phone. The number I'd had for years, the same number James used to call on Sunday evenings for their weekly catch-up. It rang 6 times, then went to voicemail. The box was full. I called again. Same result. I got in the car, drove downtown. Harrington Consolidated occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower that caught the sun like a blade. I hadn't been there before. Richard's company was something that existed in the background of family conversations, mentioned casually, the way you mention the weather or a neighbor's new car. The lobby was marble and chrome. A security desk staffed by a man in a suit who looked like he'd been trained to smile without meaning it. "I'm here to see Richard Harrington," I said. "Do you have an appointment? I'm his sister-in-law." The man picked up a phone, spoke quietly, set it down. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Mr. Harrington is unavailable today." "When is he available?" "I'm not able to share his schedule. Would you like to leave a message?" I left a message. I wrote it on the back of a business card the security guard handed me, pressing the pen so hard the ink bled through to the other side. "Call me. It's Clara, please." He never called. I drove home, the home that was no longer home, the home that had become a countdown, and sat in the driveway with the engine running, staring at the front door. The crack in the step was still there. The mailbox James had painted green the summer Daniel was born was starting to peel. The garden hose was coiled by the garage in the shape James had left it, a loose figure 8 that I hadn't moved because moving it felt like erasing him. Daniel was at the window when I went inside. He'd found the letter on the kitchen counter. "Mom, what does vacated mean?" I knelt in front of him, eye level. His face was still soft with childhood, the cheeks still round, the jawline still undefined, but his eyes held something older, something watchful. "It means we're going to move," I said. "Why?" I had no answer that wouldn't involve either a lie or a truth he wasn't ready for. So I said the only honest thing available. "I'm going to figure that out." We packed in stages. I started with the things that mattered least: the junk drawer, the linen closet, the basket of shoes by the back door. Working outward from the periphery, saving the center for last. James's office, Daniel's room, the bedroom where we'd slept for 9 years, where the mattress still held the contour of 2 bodies even though one of them would never return. Daniel packed his own room. I heard the sound of toys being sorted, a plastic rattle of things being categorized as keep or leave. He was methodical about it, precise. He didn't ask why again. On the last day, I walked through the empty house. Our footsteps echoed against bare floors. The walls bore the rectangular ghosts of frames we'd removed, lighter patches where photos had shielded the paint from years of light. The pencil marks on the doorframe were still visible. Age 3, age 4, age 5, age 6, age 7, age 8. A graph of Daniel's ascent toward a height James would never see. I touched the marks, traced the dates written in James's handwriting, small and neat, architect's lettering, precise to the quarter inch. Then I closed the front door and locked it with a key that no longer belonged to me. We drove away. Daniel was quiet in the back seat, his backpack at his feet, a stuffed bear he'd had since infancy wedged between his hip and the car door. I watched the house shrink in the rearview mirror until we turned the corner onto Highland Avenue and it disappeared behind the neighbor's oak tree. The studio apartment was above a laundromat on Jefferson Street, on the east side of town, where the streetlights buzzed and the sidewalks were cracked. One room, a kitchenette with a two-burner stove, a bathroom with a window that overlooked the alley. The washer-dryer units below us ran from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., a rhythmic thumping that traveled through the floor and into the soles of our feet like a mechanical heartbeat. Daniel stood in the center of the room with his backpack still on, looking at the space that was now our entire world. "Where do I sleep?" he asked. "Here." I pointed to the corner where I'd already set up his bed, a fold-out cot with the blue sheets from his room on Maple Lane. The sheets still smelled faintly like his old room. I'd made sure of that. He set down his backpack, sat on the cot, bounced once, testing it. "It's okay, Mom," he said. "We'll be okay." He was 8 years old, and he was comforting me. That night, after he fell asleep, I stood at the window and listened to the machines below, the tumble of fabric against steel drums, the click of quarters dropping into slots, the muffled conversation of strangers doing their laundry at 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening. I thought about Richard, about the unsigned phone messages, about the letter from the law firm, about the way he'd said, "I'll take care of everything," with his hand on my doorframe, wearing shoes that didn't leave marks. I thought about the documents I'd signed, and for the first time since James died, I felt something that wasn't grief, something with edges, something that sat low in my stomach and hummed like the machines below, steady, mechanical, and patient. I didn't have a name for it yet, but it was awake. 8 months after the eviction, I mopped the floors of the building my husband's life insurance had paid for. The irony wasn't lost on me. It sat in my throat like a fishbone, present, painful, impossible to swallow or cough up. Every night, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., I pushed a yellow mop bucket through the corridors of Harrington Consolidated, cleaning the offices of people who answered to the man who'd stolen my home, my savings, and the last material proof that James Harrington had ever existed. The job came through an agency, Nightshine Janitorial Services. They supplied cleaners to commercial buildings across Westfield, and they didn't ask questions beyond the background check and a confirmation that you could lift 40 pounds and stand for 8 hours. The pay was $14 an hour, deposited bi-weekly into a checking account that rarely held more than a few $100s above zero. I took it because the day shifts at the grocery store and the weekend work at the dry cleaners weren't enough. Daniel needed school supplies, winter boots, the orthodontist. The studio apartment cost $1,100 a month, and the utilities in that building ran high because the landlord hadn't updated the wiring since the Reagan administration. Every month was a puzzle, fitting expenses into income, like trying to close a suitcase that was always 2 inches too full. The Harrington building was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, deliberately, aggressively, without apology. The lobby was veined marble and recessed lighting. The elevators were paneled and brushed steel. The 14th floor, Richard's floor, the executive suite, was carpeted in something dense and silent that swallowed the sound of my feet. I cleaned it all. The conference rooms with their glass walls and leather chairs. The kitchen where executives left crumbs from catered lunches that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. The bathrooms with their automatic faucets and individually wrapped soap bars. And Richard's office. It was the corner suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows on two sides, overlooking the city and the direction where the suburbs began, and the houses grew larger. His desk was mahogany, not unlike the wood of James's casket, though I tried not to think about that. On it, a Bloomberg terminal, a leather-framed photo of Richard shaking hands with the governor, a crystal paperweight shaped like a bull, and a pen set that probably cost more than my rent. The first time I cleaned that office, I spent 40 minutes on surfaces that needed 10. Not because I was thorough, but because I couldn't stop looking at the framed photos on the credenza behind his desk. Richard with investors, Richard at a charity gala, Richard cutting a ribbon at a groundbreaking ceremony. And one photo, smaller than the others, tucked behind a Lucite award, Richard and James, teenagers, standing in front of a lake with fishing rods. James was grinning. Richard was looking at James the way a man looks at something he wants to own. I cleaned the glass of that frame with the same spray I used on the windows, wiped it until it was invisible. The documents started appearing in the third week. Richard, for all his calculated precision in other areas, was careless with paper. He worked late. I knew this because his office light was often still on when I arrived at 10, and the trash can held the remains of a takeout dinner consumed at the desk. On those nights, I waited. Cleaned other floors, returned at midnight or 1 a.m. when the lights were dark and the suite was empty, but the papers remained, spreadsheets left face up on the desk, financial statements stacked in the printer tray, notes scrawled on yellow legal pads in handwriting that looked like a seismograph recording, numbers I didn't understand, columns labeled EBITDA, DCR, LTV, cap rate, abbreviations from a language I hadn't learned, a country I hadn't visited. I dusted around them at first, moved them carefully to wipe the desk, then replaced them exactly. I was a janitor. The documents weren't my business. I was there to empty the trash and vacuum the carpet and make the surfaces gleam for the people who would sit at these desks in the morning without ever wondering who'd been there before dawn. But the numbers stayed in my head. Not the figures themselves, I couldn't have recalled them if asked. But the patterns, the way certain columns were highlighted in yellow, the way Richard's notes in the margins grew more emphatic as the pages progressed, more exclamation points, more underlines, more words written in capital letters, RE Finance, Extend, Cover. One night in November, I found a document on the printer that stopped me. It was a loan summary. Harrington Consolidated had a revolving credit facility of $14 million secured against, and here my eyes travel down the page to the collateral sections, secured against real property, including a residential address I knew by heart, 14 Maple Lane, Westfield, New Jersey, 07090, my house. Richard had used my home, the home he'd taken from me, the home Daniel still dreamed about, as collateral for a corporate loan. He'd mortgaged my memories to finance his ambition. I stood at the printer for a long time, long enough that the motion sensor lights in the hallway clicked off, and I was standing in darkness, illuminated only by the glow of the printer's standby indicator, a green dot pulsing like something alive. Then I took out my phone, opened the camera, and photographed the document. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a strategy or a timeline or a goal beyond the instinct that this mattered, that these numbers, this address, this web of debt and leverage and stolen collateral, it was a map. And even though I couldn't read it yet, I knew that every map led somewhere. I photographed 3 more documents that night: quarterly earnings, a board resolution authorizing additional borrowing, a letter from a bank requesting updated financial disclosures. I replaced everything exactly as I'd found it, finished cleaning the office, emptied the trash, vacuumed the carpet in neat parallel lines. Then I collected my things from the janitor's closet, clocked out at the security desk, and walked to my car in the pre-dawn cold. The sky was the color of dishwater, and my breath came in clouds that dissolved before they reached the streetlights. In the driver's seat, I opened my phone and scrolled through the photos. The numbers stared back at me: foreign, dense, impenetrable, but not forever. I knew that with a certainty that surprised me, that rose from the same low, humming place that had awakened the night we moved into the studio apartment. I would learn this language, I would read this map, and I would find out exactly where it led. The parent-teacher conference was held in Daniel's classroom on the second floor of Lincoln Elementary, in a room that smelled like dry erase markers and the faint, sweet residue of juice boxes. Small chairs were arranged in a semicircle, and the walls were covered with construction paper projects, handprint turkeys, book reports on poster board, a timeline of the American Revolution rendered in crayon. Daniel's teacher was Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the practiced calm of someone who'd spent 3 decades managing the emotional weather systems of 9-year-olds. She sat across from me at a table designed for children, her knees pressed together, a manila folder open between us. Daniel is an exceptional student, she said. His reading level is 2 years ahead. His math is strong. He's quiet, thoughtful, well-liked. I waited for the conjunction. In my experience, compliments that begin with a list always end with a but. But I've noticed some things I want to discuss with you. There it was. She pulled a sheet from the folder. A writing assignment. The prompt was write about your family. Daniel's handwriting was small and precise. The letters formed with the same careful intentionality James had brought to his architectural sketches. Even his penmanship was an inheritance. He wrote a beautiful essay, Mrs. Patterson said, but there's a passage that concerned me. She turned the paper so I could read it. Halfway down the page, underlined in red by the teacher, was a paragraph that landed in my chest like a fist. My Uncle Richard took our house after my dad died. My mom doesn't say that, but I know, because houses don't just go away. Someone has to take them. My dad built things. Uncle Richard takes things. That's the difference between them. I read it twice. The handwriting didn't waver. The sentences were declarative, factual, stripped of the emotional padding that adults use to make uncomfortable truths bearable. A 9-year-old's clarity, undiluted by diplomacy. Mrs. Patterson was watching me with the careful expression of a woman who had navigated 100 of these conversations and knew that the next 30 seconds would determine whether this became productive or defensive. I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate is happening at home, she said quickly, but when a child makes allegations about a family member, even indirectly, I'm required to flag it. It's not an allegation, I said. The words came out before I could shape them, flat, factual. My son's cadence, Mrs. Missy as the mutt. Patterson blinked. He's right, I continued. His uncle maneuvered the estate documents after my husband's death and transferred our home into a company he controls. We were evicted 5 months later. Saying it aloud, in a room full of construction paper turkeys and juice box residue, made it more real than the certified letter or the security guard who wouldn't let me pass the lobby. More real because it came out of my mouth in my own voice, unmediated by legal language or the gauze of grief. My son's uncle stole our house. Mrs. Patterson closed the folder slowly. I'm sorry, Mrs. Harrington. I didn't know the specifics. Most people don't. We talked for a few more minutes about Daniel's emotional health, about counseling resources, about the school's ability to provide a stable environment. She was kind, genuinely kind, not the performed kindness of condolence casseroles and embroidered handkerchiefs. She offered a referral to a family therapist. I took the card. I never called the number. I picked Daniel up from after-school care. He climbed into the back seat with his backpack and his overstuffed library book, something about undersea volcanoes, and buckled his seatbelt with the practiced efficiency of a child who does everything for himself, because he's learned that the world requires self-sufficiency earlier than advertised. How was the conference, he asked. Good. Mrs. Patterson says you're doing great. Did she show you my family essay? She did. A pause. The car idled at a red light. Rain had started, a thin, persistent drizzle that made the brake lights ahead of us bloom into red halos. Was I wrong? He asked. About Uncle Richard? I looked at him in the rearview mirror. His face was tilted slightly, the way James used to tilt his head when he was working through a problem, an angle of concentration, of genuine curiosity about whether the answer he'd arrived at was correct. No, I said. You weren't wrong. He nodded. Opened his library book. Didn't pursue it further. The heat of shame I'd felt in that classroom, the burning awareness that my child had presented our catastrophe as a school assignment, that his grief had become curriculum, it didn't dissipate as I drove. It changed, transmuted. Like water heating in a sealed container, it couldn't escape, so it altered its state. I drove past the turn for Jefferson Street, past the laundromat, past the studio apartment, past the fluorescent bodega on the corner. I kept driving, guided by something I couldn't name, until I reached the Westfield Public Library on Elm Avenue. The building was brick and glass, built in the 70s, with that particular institutional warmth that libraries maintain, a temperature calibrated for sitting still and paying attention. The carpet was green. The lights were the kind that hum at a frequency you stop hearing after 10 minutes. I walked to the nonfiction section, business and finance. Row after row of spines in muted colors, navy, burgundy, forest green, with titles set in sans serif type, corporate finance, principles of accounting, the intelligent investor, debt markets, a practitioner's guide. I pulled one off the shelf, Introduction to Financial Statements by Dr. Eleanor Voss. The cover was plain, white with black text, a single chart in the center. I opened it to the first page and read the first sentence standing in the aisle, my coat still damp from the rain. Every financial statement tells a story. The question is whether you know how to read it. Something clicked, not a dramatic revelation, not a lightning bolt or a moment of cinematic clarity, something quieter than that, a tumbler falling into place inside a lock I hadn't known existed. The sound a key makes when it enters the right door for the first time. I checked out 7 books that evening. The librarian, a young man with glasses and a cardigan, had to override the system because the maximum was 5. Big research project, he asked. Something like that. I carried the books to the car in a canvas bag that cut into my shoulder, set them on the passenger seat where James used to sit, drove home to the studio apartment with the machines thumping below and Daniel doing homework on his cot. That night, after he fell asleep, I opened the first book under the light of a desk lamp I'd bought at a thrift store for $3. The pages smelled like old ink and library paste. I read until 1 a.m, until the columns of numbers on the sample financial statements started to look less like a foreign alphabet and more like a grammar I could learn. I didn't know it then, couldn't have imagined the scale of what I was beginning, but that walk into the Westfield Public Library was the first step of an 8-year journey, the first page of a war that would be fought in silence, with no weapons but knowledge and patience. The war Richard didn't know had started, because he'd never thought to look at the woman with the library card. I studied the way other people breathe, without thinking about it, without stopping, without asking whether it was practical or sane. Every night after Daniel fell asleep, I cleared the kitchen counter of his homework and spread out my own. Library books opened to chapters on balance sheets and income statements, printouts from the business section of the Westfield free access computers, where I spent my lunch breaks reading SEC filings and investment glossaries. Spiral notebooks filled with terms I was teaching myself, amortization, subordinated debt, debt service coverage ratio, covenant violation, written in handwriting that grew smaller and more precise as the weeks turned into months, as though the knowledge itself was compressing me into something denser and harder. The photographs from Richard's office fed the study. Each week I captured 3 or 4 documents, never from the same spot, never anything that would be missed. I photographed with the screen brightness dimmed, standing in the dark office with my phone held at chest height, the shutter sound disabled. Then I spent the next day at the library cross-referencing what I'd found against the textbooks, building a picture of Harrington Consolidated's financial anatomy the way an archaeologist assembles a skeleton from scattered bones. What I found was this. Richard's company was leveraged to a degree that would have made a finance professor wince. For every dollar of equity, he'd borrowed nearly 4. The loans were spread across 6 banks, each holding a piece of the collateral: commercial real estate, equipment, receivables, and the residential properties he'd folded into his holding company, including mine. But leverage alone didn't make a company fragile. What made it fragile was the gap between the interest Richard owed and the income his company generated. The debt service coverage ratio, a number I'd learned to calculate in the second week of my education, was hovering at 1.1. For context, most lenders required 1.25 as a minimum. Richard's company was generating just enough revenue to service its debt, with virtually nothing left for the unexpected. 1 bad quarter, 1 lost contract, 1 shift in the interest rate environment, and the entire structure would begin to wobble. I understood this with a clarity that felt almost physical, the way you feel the structural logic of a building when someone explains where the load-bearing walls are. James would have understood it instantly. He was an architect, after all. He knew that beauty without structure was just decoration. Richard had built a beautiful company, but the foundations were sand. The realization arrived on a Thursday in April, 14 months after I'd started cleaning Harrington Consolidated. I was sitting in the library's second-floor study carrel, surrounded by 4 books and a legal pad filled with calculations, when the shape of Richard's empire finally resolved into focus. I could see it: the debt, the leverage, the thin margin, the vulnerability. I could see exactly where the cracks would form when the pressure came. And I understood for the first time that this knowledge was a kind of power, not power I could use, not yet. I was a janitor with a checking account balance of $847 and a son who needed braces. The gap between understanding Richard's vulnerability and doing anything about it was the gap between reading a map and walking the territory. But the map was mine now, and no one knew I had it. Margaret Chen found me in the break room at 2 in the morning on a Friday in May. Margaret was night security, a compact woman in her early 60s with close-cropped silver hair and the bearing of someone who had served in the military, which she had. She wore the night-shine security uniform like a costume she found mildly amusing, and she carried herself with the casual authority of a person who had decided decades ago that other people's opinions were a currency she didn't trade in. I was reading a chapter on distressed debt acquisition, my mop parked against the vending machine, when she appeared in the doorway with a styrofoam cup of coffee and an expression of frank curiosity. "Financial analysis," she said, reading the spine of my book upside down. "Light bedtime reading." "It's for a course," I said automatically. "What course?" I didn't have an answer prepared. The lie had been reflexive, the kind of cover story that works only when no one follows up. Margaret was not a person who failed to follow up. "A personal one," I said. Margaret sat down across from me, set her coffee on the table, studied me with eyes that had the quality of a laser level, measuring, precise, uninterested in charm. "You've been working here for a year," she said. "You show up before shift, you stay after. You clean like you mean it, but you read like your life depends on it. And every Thursday night you spend an extra 40 minutes on the 14th floor." She paused. Richard Harrington's floor. My stomach dropped. The sensation was like missing a step on a staircase, a lurch of weightlessness followed by the hard return of gravity. "I'm not stealing anything," I said. I know you're not, honey. I watch the cameras. She sipped her coffee. But I'm curious about the woman who mops a billionaire's floor and reads financial textbooks at 2 in the morning. That's not a course, that's a mission. I looked at her, at the steady, unblinking assessment in her expression, at the way she held her coffee, both hands, like a signal fire she was warming herself beside. I could have deflected, made another excuse, changed the subject to something safe, the weather, the vending machine's tendency to eat quarters, the new carpet in the lobby. Instead, I said, Richard Harrington is my brother-in-law. He stole my house after my husband died. The words came out level and clear. No tremor, no self-pity, just the facts, delivered the way financial statements are delivered, in columns with totals. Margaret set her coffee down. She didn't gasp. She didn't say, I'm sorry. She didn't reach for my hand or make a sound of sympathetic outrage. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, what are you going to do about it? Not what happened, not how do you feel, not have you tried talking to a lawyer. What are you going to do about it? Present tense, active voice, the grammar of someone who assumed that grieving and planning were not mutually exclusive activities. I'm learning, I said. Learning what? How his company works, where it's weak. Margaret nodded, picked up her coffee, stood. Good, she said. I looked at her, at the steady, unblinking assessment in her expression. When you need someone to watch the cameras and not see things, you know where to find me. She walked out. Her boots echoed in the hallway, a steady, unhurried rhythm that sounded like the footsteps of a woman who had heard 100 stories worse than mine and had learned that the only ones worth remembering were the ones that ended with someone standing up. Victor Asante's office was in a converted storefront on the ground floor of the Westfield Community Legal Center, a space that smelled like carpet cleaner and good intentions. The furniture was donated, the filing cabinets were dented, the fluorescent tube above his desk flickered at a frequency that would drive a person to madness or meditation, depending on their temperament. Victor chose meditation. He was a tall man with careful hands and an accent that carried traces of Accra and New Haven in equal measure, the product of a childhood in Ghana and a law degree from Yale that he'd followed with a decade of corporate litigation at a firm in Manhattan before deciding, at 42, that he'd rather help people who couldn't afford him than bill people who could. I'd met him 18 months ago, 3 weeks after the eviction, when I'd walked into the legal center with a folder of documents and a question I already knew the answer to, can you get my house back? He'd been honest. The holding company structure Richard had used was legally sound, if ethically grotesque. The documents I'd signed, while obtained under circumstances that a sympathetic judge might call coercive, were technically voluntary. Challenging them would require litigation that could take years and cost money I didn't have. I'm sorry, Mrs. Harrington, he'd said. The law isn't always the same thing as justice. I'd left that day thinking I'd never go back. But here I was, 20 months later, sitting in the same chair with a different folder and a different question. I want to understand how distressed debt works, I said. Victor leaned back. His chair creaked, a sound that punctuated most of his conversations. Distressed debt? That's a specific area. What's prompting this? Hypothetically, I said, if a company has significant leverage, say a debt-to-equity ratio above 3 to 1, and some of that debt is sold on the secondary market at a discount, could an individual purchase it? Hypothetically, Victor's tone carried the weight of a man who understood that hypotheticals in his line of work were rarely hypothetical. Yes, distressed debt trades on secondary markets just like any other financial instrument. Banks and institutional lenders sell off loans they want off their books, usually at a fraction of face value, 30 cents on the dollar, sometimes less, depending on the perceived risk of default. And the purchaser acquires the same rights as the original lender? In most cases, yes, including the right to collect, the right to negotiate, and in some structures, if the debt is secured, the right to foreclose on collateral. I let that settle. The word foreclose sat in the room like a detonation that hadn't gone off yet. Could a person set up an LLC to make these purchases anonymously? I asked. They could. Victor was watching me the way a surgeon watches a patient's vital signs, not the words themselves, but the rhythms beneath them. Clara, may I ask, is this about Harrington Consolidated? I didn't answer immediately. Outside, a bus passed on the street, its air brakes releasing with a sound like a sigh. Yes, I said. Victor was quiet for a long moment. He picked up a pen, set it down, picked it up again. You want to buy your brother-in-law's debt. I want to explore the possibility. There's a difference between exploring a possibility and climbing into a lion's cage to count its teeth. He said this without judgment, just observation. If Richard discovers that his sister-in-law is acquiring his company's debt, the legal response would be swift. Restraining orders, tortious interference claims. He'd bury you in motions before you could accumulate enough to matter. Then he can't discover it, I said. Victor studied me. The fluorescent light flickered twice. How much capital do you have? He asked. $340. Right now. His eyebrows rose, not in surprise, but in the kind of recalibration a person does when they realize the scale of what they're hearing is smaller than expected, but the ambition behind it is immeasurably larger. $340, he repeated. It's a start. Clara, a round lot of distressed debt typically starts at $10,000. Typically, but not always, there are micro-lot brokers, online platforms that sell individual tranches. I've been reading. The silence that followed was the kind that separates the moment before a decision from the moment after. Victor could have gently redirected me, could have suggested therapy or financial aid or the name of a women's shelter. He could have said what most people would have said, let it go, Clara. Move on, build a new life. Instead, he opened his desk drawer, pulled out a business card, and wrote a phone number on the back. Marcus Webb, he said. He's a broker who specializes in fractional debt instruments. Minimum purchase, $200. He's not going to ask you why. He paused. And neither am I. Not today. I called Marcus Webb the following Thursday from the parking lot of the laundromat, sitting in my car with the engine off and Daniel visible through the window, doing homework at the folding table inside. The transaction was unremarkable. A phone call, a wire transfer from my checking account, an email confirmation. $340, the amount I'd saved over 6 months by eating one meal a day on Tuesdays and Thursdays, by cutting Daniel's hair myself instead of paying for it, by walking to work when the car needed gas I couldn't afford. What I bought was a tiny fragment of Harrington Consolidated's outstanding debt, a senior note discounted to 32 cents on the dollar with a face value of $1,062. My $340 had purchased the right to collect $1,062 from Richard's company if it could pay. If it couldn't, I held a claim on the collateral. It was nothing, a rounding error. A speck of dust on the ledger of a company with $14 million in outstanding obligations. But I held the certificate, a single PDF on my phone, displayed on a screen cracked from when Daniel had dropped it in the bathroom, and I felt something move through me that I hadn't felt since before James died. Not hope. Hope was too large, too fragile, too dependent on external validation. This was something older and more precise. Ownership, a piece of what Richard had built with stolen money now belonged to me. A fraction of a fraction, invisible to everyone, registered under an LLC I'd formed for $65 at the county clerk's office using a name I'd chosen with deliberate care. Phoenix Holdings. I closed my phone, watched Daniel through the laundromat window. He was writing something in his notebook, his head tilted at James's angle, his pen moving with James's precision. The machines thumped and spun around him. The fluorescent lights hummed. An old woman folded sheets at the next table, her movements practiced and rhythmic. I sat in the car for a long time. The evening turned blue, then dark. The streetlights came on. I started the engine. The first $340 was nothing, but every empire, even the one I was building, had to start with a single brick. Daniel turned 12 in February, and I almost missed it. Not the date. I knew the date the way I knew my own pulse, hardwired into the part of me that tracked the essential rhythms of his existence, but I nearly forgot to buy him something. The week of his birthday, I'd been calculating the yield on a tranche of Harrington debt that had come available through Marcus Webb, $3,000 face value, selling at 28 cents. The purchase would cost $840, which was almost exactly the amount I had earmarked for Daniel's birthday and the electric bill combined. I spent 2 days doing math that wasn't really math. It was negotiation with myself, with the version of me that wanted to be a good mother, and with the version that had become something else entirely. The $840 purchase would bring Phoenix Holdings' total position to 4% of Harrington's outstanding debt, up from the 2.7% I'd accumulated over the previous 2 years through dozens of microtransactions. 4%. Still nothing. Still a rounding error. But the trajectory mattered. Each purchase was a step, and the steps were accelerating as more of Richard's debt was downgraded and sold at deeper discounts. I bought Daniel a pair of sneakers, the ones he'd circled in a magazine he'd found in the school library, white with blue accents, the kind his classmates wore. They cost $78, marked down from $120 at the outlet store across town. I wrapped them in newspaper because I'd run out of wrapping paper and didn't want to spend another $3. He loved them. He put them on immediately and walked around the apartment in tight circles, testing the cushioning, examining the stitching with the focused attention of a boy who had learned to appreciate things that came infrequently. "Thanks, Mom." He was sitting on his cot, the sneakers still on, his old shoes set neatly beside the door as though they were retiring with dignity. "These are really good. Happy birthday, sweetheart." I'd made a cake, box mix, vanilla frosting from a can, 12 candles from the dollar store. We ate it sitting on his cot, the plate balanced between us, and he told me about a science project involving electromagnets and a hypothesis about current strength that was, I realized, remarkably sophisticated for a 12-year-old. He had James's mind, the quiet, methodical intelligence that saw systems instead of surfaces. He would map the magnetic field lines the way James had mapped structural loads, with precision, with patience, with the belief that understanding something deeply was the first step toward building something better. Later that night, after the cake was eaten and the candles were washed and dried for reuse next year, Daniel asked me a question. "Mom, why are you always so tired?" He was lying on his cot, the new sneakers set carefully on the floor beside him. I was at the kitchen counter, a library book open in front of me, my hand wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. "Work," I said. "Night shifts are rough." "Work, day shifts too, and you study at night. I hear you." The apartment was small enough that privacy was a polite fiction. He could hear me turning pages the way I could hear him breathing in his sleep. The rhythms of shared space, the involuntary intimacy of poverty. "I'm studying for something important," I said. "What?" "Our future." He was quiet for a moment. The laundromat machines below us had stopped. It was past 10, the last load collected, the last quarter spent. "Why don't we move to a bigger place?" he asked. "Aiden's apartment has 2 bedrooms and it's almost the same price." Aiden was his school friend. I'd met his mother once, a nurse at the community hospital, a woman with competent hands and the tired eyes of someone who worked the same hours I did, but in a profession that came with health insurance. "We're saving," I said. "For what? You said college, but that's years away." The lie sat between us like a pane of glass, transparent, fragile, distorting everything on the other side. I couldn't tell him the truth, that every dollar I saved beyond the bare minimum of survival went into an LLC that was slowly, methodically purchasing his uncle's corporate debt. That the reason we lived in one room and ate rice 3 nights a week and hadn't gone to a movie since James died wasn't poverty, it was war. I'll explain when you're older, I said. It was the coward's answer. The mother's refuge when the truth is either too dangerous or too complicated to give a child. Daniel accepted it the way he accepted most things I said, with a nod, a pause, and a look that told me he was filing my non-answer in the same place I'd filed Richard's expression at the funeral. He turned off his lamp. "Night, Mom. Night, baby." I sat in the dark after he fell asleep, listening to his breathing settle into the slow, even rhythm of a child who trusted the world enough to close his eyes in it. The coffee was cold in my hands. The book was open to a chapter on debt covenants. There was a moment, brief, sharp, involuntary, where I imagined spending the $840 on something else, a bigger apartment, a weekend trip. New jeans for Daniel, whose current pair was an inch too short at the ankle, a life that looked like a life instead of a staging area for a campaign he couldn't see. The moment passed. I picked up my phone and texted Marcus Webb, "Proceed with the purchase." The reply came back in 12 seconds, confirmed. Phoenix Holdings position updated. I closed the phone, looked at Daniel's sneakers on the floor, their white surfaces catching the streetlight through the window. New and clean and carefully placed, as though they were the most valuable things in the room. They were. But so was the spreadsheet on my phone that showed $840 moving from a checking account into a debt instrument that would, in the fullness of time, become a lever long enough to move a man who didn't know he was standing on a fulcrum. Margaret noticed first. She found me in the break room the following week, standing by the microwave, and said without preamble, "You've lost weight." "I've been busy." "Busy isn't a diet plan, Clara." She handed me a protein bar from her jacket pocket. "Eat. Whatever war you're fighting, you can't fight it from a hospital bed." I ate the protein bar. It tasted like chalk and artificial peanut butter and the particular kindness of a woman who paid attention when no one else did. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me. Get a meal plan. And stop skipping Tuesdays and Thursdays. I can tell because you clean faster when you're hungry." She was right about all of it. I was starving myself at the altar of a plan that might take a decade. And the cost wasn't abstract. It was measured in the inches Daniel's jeans were too short, in the circles under my eyes that makeup couldn't cover anymore, in the distance between the mother I wanted to be and the soldier I was becoming. But the plan required capital. And capital required sacrifice. And sacrifice required the willingness to hold two truths at once. That I was doing this for Daniel, and that doing this for Daniel required taking things away from Daniel. The math wouldn't balance. It never does in war. You just keep paying the price and hoping the interest compounds. The hallway on the 14th floor was 37 steps long. I knew this because I'd mopped it 412 times over the past 3 years, and certain measurements become permanent when repetition converts them from observations into facts. It was a Wednesday in October. 11:40 p.m. I was working the executive suite, Richard's floor, with the methodical pace I developed to maximize my time near his office while maintaining the appearance of someone who was simply doing her job. The cleaning cart rolled ahead of me on wheels that needed oil, producing a faint squeak every third rotation that Margaret had once compared to a mouse with opinions. Richard's office light was on. This happened approximately one night in 5. He worked late when quarter end approached, or when a deal was in flux. I'd learned his patterns the way weather forecasters learn pressure systems, tracking the variables that predicted his presence. On those nights, I adjusted my route, start with the kitchen, move to the conference rooms. Save the executive suite for after midnight, when the light would be off and the office would be empty except for whatever he'd left behind. But tonight was different. At 11:50, the conference room door at the end of the hall opened, and voices spilled out. 2 men, their tones carrying the particular urgency of a conversation that had started as strategy and devolved into crisis management. I recognized Richard's voice immediately. Years of cleaning his office had tuned my ear to its frequencies, the confident baritone he used in meetings, the clipped irritation when things weren't moving fast enough, and tonight something rarer, a strained quality, thin at the edges, like a wire carrying more current than its gauge was rated for. The second voice belonged to a man I'd seen in the building but never learned the name of until that moment. Richard addressed him as Garrett, the CFO. The covenant test is in 6 weeks, Garrett was saying. If we don't hit the coverage ratio, First Federal triggers the default clause. We're looking at accelerated repayment on the entire facility. How much? 14.2 million, due within 90 days of trigger. A silence, the kind of silence that contains math. What are our options? Richard asked. Refinance with another lender, but our credit profile is, to be frank, not attractive right now. The downgrade in August hurt us. Any new lender is going to want a rate premium that eats the margin we don't have. So we restructure. Restructure requires creditor consent, and we've got debt spread across 6 institutions. Getting them all to agree on modified terms is, then we figure it out. Richard's voice hardened. The wire drew tighter. I didn't build this company to watch a covenant technicality bring it down. Get Whitaker on the phone tomorrow. I want a term sheet for restructuring by end of week. Whitaker, the same law firm whose name had been on the eviction letter I'd received 5 years ago. The men moved into the hallway. I was standing 14 feet away, mop in hand, positioned at the intersection where the corridor turned toward the elevator bank. I'd been cleaning the same 3-foot section of floor for the duration of their conversation, slow circular strokes that kept my hands moving and my body still. Richard walked out first. His tie was loosened, his jacket was off. He looked like a man who had aged 2 years in an evening. The careful composure I'd watched him maintain for years now showing fractures, subtle, hairline, visible only to someone who'd been studying the surface as long as I had. He saw me. For a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, he looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you've walked past 1,000 times. Recognition without identification. His brain registered cleaning woman, night shift, building staff. Then the recognition shifted, deepened. His eyes narrowed, and something traveled across his face, a sequence of micro-expressions that I cataloged in real time. Confusion, then surprise, then the rapid recalibration of a man encountering a context he hadn't prepared for. Clara? He said my name the way you say the name of a city you once visited and hadn't thought about since. Is that you? Hello, Richard. My voice was level. My hands were on the mop handle. My cleaning cart was behind me, loaded with spray bottles and rags and the tools of a trade that rendered me invisible to everyone in this building, including the man who'd put me here. I didn't know you worked here, he said. Genuine surprise. I could tell because it disorganized him. Richard was never disorganized. How long have you been? 3 years. His mouth opened, then closed. The CFO stood behind him, shifting his weight, uninterested in whatever domestic reconnection was unfolding in the hallway. Richard ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd never seen him make. How are you? How's Danny? Danny, the nickname James used. Hearing it from Richard's mouth was like hearing a stolen song played on a broken instrument. Daniel is fine, I said. Thank you for asking. The formality was deliberate. A wall built from politeness, the kind of barrier that's more effective than anger because it offers no handholds for a response. Richard nodded, adjusted his cuff, the gestures of a man reassembling his performance in real time. If you ever need anything, he started. I don't. Another silence. Shorter, sharper. Right. Well, take care, Clara. He walked past me. The CFO followed. Their footsteps receded toward the elevator. Richard's leather soles quiet on the carpet, Garrett's harder shoes clicking against the marble transition strip at the elevator bank. The doors opened, closed. The floor number display counted down, 14, 13, 12. I stood in the hallway with my mop and my cart, and the conversation I just overheard replaying in my mind with the precision of a recording. Covenant test in 6 weeks, coverage ratio deficiency, 14.2 million in accelerated repayment, restructuring requiring creditor consent. Creditor consent. I was a creditor. A small one. Phoenix Holdings currently held 4.3% of Harrington's total outstanding debt. Not enough to block a restructuring. Not enough to dictate terms, but enough to have a seat at the table if the company entered formal negotiations. And now I knew the timeline. 6 weeks. I finished mopping the floor, cleaned Richard's office, the desk, the credenza, the crystal paperweight. He'd left the conference room lights on. I turned them off. In the elevator going down, I caught my reflection in the brushed steel doors. A woman in a nightshine uniform, her hair pulled back, her face showing the particular fatigue of someone who works 2 jobs and sleeps 4 hours. The mop handle was still in my hand. Richard hadn't recognized me for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds of being invisible to the man who'd taken everything from me. It was, I realized, the most valuable thing he'd ever given me. Phoenix Holdings had a brokerage account, an LLC registration, and a post office box in a strip mall on Route 22. It had no employees, no office, no letterhead, no website. It existed in the spaces between things, between purchases, between filings, between the woman who mopped floors and the entity that was quietly acquiring the right to collect on debts owed by the company that employed her. By the end of that year, 4 years into the war I was waging from a studio apartment above a laundromat, Phoenix Holdings owned 12% of Harrington Consolidated's total outstanding debt. The purchases had been made in quantities small enough to avoid triggering the reporting thresholds that would have alerted Richard's legal team. No single transaction exceeded $5,000. No pattern was detectable unless you stood far enough back to see the shape of what was forming, the way pointillist paintings only resolve into images when you stop looking at the individual dots. Victor was the only person who knew the full picture. Margaret knew the broad strokes. Enough to understand why I studied at 2 a.m. and why her cameras sometimes didn't record the 14th floor as clearly as they should have. But Victor was the one who helped me structure the purchases, who reviewed the documentation, who made sure each acquisition was legally clean and operationally invisible. We met at his office every other Saturday. Daniel was at his friend Aiden's house, the reliable weekend arrangement that gave me 4 hours of uninterrupted planning time while a 12-year-old played video games and ate pizza that someone else's mother had ordered. "You're at 12%, Victor said, his pen tracing the column of purchases on the spreadsheet I'd printed at the library. "That's meaningful. Not controlling, but meaningful." How meaningful? In most restructuring scenarios, a creditor holding 10% or more of total debt gets a voice. Not a veto, but a voice. You'd be in the room. "In the room isn't enough," I said. "Clara," he set the pen down, "you started this with $340. You're now holding debt with a face value of," he checked the spreadsheet, $1.7 million. Purchased for approximately $62,000 over 4 years, most of it scraped from a janitor's salary. That's extraordinary. It's not enough. To do what exactly? The question hung between us. I'd been avoiding it, not because I didn't have an answer, but because the answer, spoken aloud, would make it real, would commit me to a trajectory I couldn't reverse. To control the outcome, I said, not influence it, control it. Victor was quiet for a long time. Outside his window, a kid rode past on a bicycle, the training wheels clicking against the pavement. "That would require a blocking position," he said carefully. Depending on the covenant structure, somewhere between 25 and 35% of total outstanding debt. At current discount rates, you're looking at another $60,000 to $80,000. I know. Where are you going to get that kind of money? You're already stretching everything you have. I didn't answer immediately. The answer was one I'd been thinking about for months, turning it over in the dark hours between Daniel's bedtime and my own fitful sleep, an answer that made me feel sick in a way that no financial calculation ever had. Daniel's college fund, I said. Victor's pen stopped moving. There's 11,000 in his 529 plan, I continued, from the automatic deposits James set up before he died. I haven't added to it. I've been diverting everything to Phoenix, but the original deposits have been compounding for 12 years. Clara, that's your son's education. My son's education will be meaningless if his uncle controls the company that should be his inheritance. The words came out harder than I intended, steel wrapped in certainty, leaving no room for the doubt that lived beneath it. Richard is sitting on assets worth $40 million. The trust structure I'm building would put Daniel's name on a restructured company that generates $7 million a year in revenue. $11,000 in a 529 plan is a rounding error compared to what I'm fighting for. Victor looked at me, not with judgment. Victor didn't judge, but with something adjacent to it, the recognition that the woman sitting in front of him had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, that the boundary between justice and obsession was behind her, and she'd kept walking. Have you told him? Victor asked. He's 12. He won't always be 12. I left Victor's office that afternoon and drove to the laundromat parking lot, sat in the car with the engine off, stared at the windshield. The doubt was enormous. Not about the plan. The plan was sound. The math worked. The legal structure was clean. The timing, if the economy cooperated, was viable. The doubt was about me. When had this stopped being about Daniel? When had the spreadsheets and the midnight photographs and the whispered phone calls to Marcus Webb become something that existed for their own sake, a mechanism of control that satisfied a need I hadn't known I had until Richard took everything and I discovered that the opposite of helplessness wasn't safety but power? I pulled out my phone, opened the Phoenix Holding portfolio, stared at the number $1,723,400 in face value debt, acquired for $62,000 over 4 years. Below the number, the list of individual purchases scrolled down the screen like a timeline of my own transformation. Each transaction was annotated with the date and the source of funds: grocery savings, overtime pay, sold furniture, birthday money returned, skipped dentist appointment, one meal day. Each one a small sacrifice. Each one a choice made in the space between who I was and who I was becoming. I closed the app, called Marcus Webb. Marcus, I need to talk about increasing my position. How much are we talking? Everything I have. That night, I lay awake in the studio apartment and listened to Daniel breathe. The machines below us were silent. It was past midnight. The laundromat closed. The quarters spent. The only sound was his breathing and the distant hum of the refrigerator. I thought about James, about what he would say if he could see what I'd become. The woman who read financial textbooks in the place where a novel used to sit. The woman who chose debt instruments over dental appointments. The woman who was considering spending her son's college fund to buy leverage over the man who'd stolen their home. James would have understood the anger. He might even have understood the plan, but I wasn't sure he would have understood the person executing it. That was the part that frightened me. Not Richard, not the risk, not the money, the possibility that I had become someone my husband wouldn't recognize. I found the guardianship papers on a Thursday in December, 6 days before Christmas. Richard's office was empty. He'd left at 9 that evening, earlier than usual. The cleaning crew had already finished the lower floors, and the building was quiet with the particular hush of commercial spaces after hours. ventilation systems cycling, elevator shafts humming, the faint electronic pulse of standby monitors glowing in dark offices like the eyes of animals watching from a forest. I was cleaning his desk. The routine was automatic. Right side first, then the center, then the left drawer where he kept a leather folder of active documents. I never opened the drawer. The documents I photographed came from the desk surface, the printer tray, the conference room table, places where Richard's carelessness created openings. The drawer was private in a way that surfaces weren't, and I'd maintained that boundary with the discipline of someone who understood that rules, even self-imposed ones, were the infrastructure that kept a covert operation from becoming a crime. But tonight the drawer was open. Not fully 2 inches, as though Richard had pushed it shut in haste and the latch hadn't caught. Through the gap, I could see the edge of the leather folder, and protruding from the folder's pocket, the corner of a photograph. I recognized the photo paper, the matte finish, the slightly warm tone of a print processed at a pharmacy counter rather than a professional lab. I'd printed hundreds of photos at the same kind of place: birthday parties, school events, Saturday mornings at the park with James. I pulled the drawer open. The photograph was of Daniel. He was younger in the image, 9, maybe 10, standing in front of Lincoln Elementary with his backpack on, squinting into the sun. The photo had been taken from across the street, from the angle of someone sitting in a parked car. It wasn't a posed shot. It wasn't a family photo clipped from social media. It was surveillance. My hand was steady when I picked it up. I noted this with a detached precision of someone observing their own body from a distance. Steady hands, dry palms, heart rate elevated but controlled. The response of a woman who had trained herself over 4 years of midnight intelligence gathering to process shock without displaying it. Behind the photograph, in the leather folder, were documents. The first was a typed letter from Whitaker, Sloan and Associates to Richard A. Harrington, dated 18 months after James's death. The subject line read, R.E. Petition for Emergency Guardianship, Daniel J. Harrington. I read it standing in the dark office, the desk lamp casting a circle of light that felt like a spotlight in a theater where I was both audience and performer. The letter outlined a legal strategy for removing Daniel from my custody. The basis: financial instability, inadequate housing, absence of a stable parental figure. The evidence they planned to present included my employment records, janitorial work, irregular hours, our living situation, the studio apartment, below code heating, and a psychological evaluation they intended to request through family services. The second document was a draft petition, pre-filled, ready to file. Richard's name was in the guardianship applicant field. His address, my former address, 14 Maple Lane, was listed as the proposed residence for the minor child. He had planned to take my son, to put Daniel in the house he'd stolen from us, under the roof that James's money had paid for, and raise him as his own. The final piece of the theft, not just the money, not just the home, but the child. The petition was unsigned, undated. The letter from Whitaker included a handwritten note in the margin, Richard's writing, "Hold for now. Revisit if situation changes." Hold for now. The words had the casual quality of a man deferring a task on his to-do list. Not abandoned, postponed. Kept in a drawer, 2 inches open, ready to be pulled out when the circumstances aligned or when the woman mopping his floors became inconvenient enough to remove entirely. I photographed every page, front and back, close-ups of the handwritten notes, wide shots of the full documents, 12 images total, taken with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that evidence has a shelf life and opportunities don't repeat. Then I replaced everything. The documents in the folder in the drawer pushed closed until the latch caught with a sound like a small bone breaking. I finished cleaning the office, sprayed the desk, wiped the glass, emptied the trash, 3 takeout containers, a coffee cup, a crumpled draft of an email to an investor that began with the words, "I assure you that Harrington Consolidated's financial position remains strong." I vacuumed the carpet in neat parallel lines. The elevator ride down was 14 floors and 47 seconds. I counted. The numbers helped. They gave my mind something to hold while the rest of me processed what I'd found. In the car, I sat with the engine off and the photographs on my phone and the taste of something metallic in my mouth, a physical manifestation of an emotion I hadn't felt before. Not anger, not fear, something that contained both of those things but was alchemized by the addition of a third element, the maternal recognition that the threat wasn't abstract anymore. He hadn't just stolen my house, he hadn't just taken the money. He had considered, had engaged attorneys, had drafted legal documents, had built a strategy for taking my child. Daniel, the boy who slept in a cot in a studio apartment, who wore sneakers wrapped in newspaper, who wrote essays about stolen houses with the unflinching clarity of someone who had already learned that the powerful take what they want and the powerless are told to be grateful. I didn't cry. I'd used up crying years ago, spent it like a currency that had depreciated beyond recovery. What I felt was colder than tears and more precise than rage. It was the feeling of a mission changing shape, of the parameters tightening, of a woman who had been buying debt to reclaim a house, suddenly understanding that the house was never the point. Daniel was the point. Daniel had always been the point. I started the car, drove home, walked up the stairs, opened the door to the studio apartment where my son was sleeping in a cot, with the blue sheets from Maple Lane and the bear he'd had since infancy. I sat on the edge of his cot and listened to him breathe. The machines were quiet. The streetlight came through the window and laid a stripe of amber across the floor. I stayed there until morning. I didn't sleep. By dawn, I had made a decision. The debt purchases would accelerate. The timeline would compress. Whatever it took, the college fund, the overtime, the meals I wouldn't eat, and the sleep I wouldn't get, I would build a position large enough to control Richard's fate. Not for the house, not for the money, not for revenge. For the boy sleeping 3 feet away from me, whose breath was the most important sound in the world. I hadn't visited James's grave since the funeral. 5 years. 5 years of driving past the exit for Graceland Memorial on Route 9. 5 years of telling myself I'd go next week, next month, when things were less busy, when the plan was further along, when I had something to report. 5 years of treating my dead husband's resting place like a meeting I kept rescheduling because I wasn't prepared for the agenda. The truth was simpler and uglier. I was afraid of what I'd feel. The grief I'd channeled into spreadsheets and debt purchases and midnight photographs existed in a pressurized state, contained, directed, useful. Visiting James's grave risked releasing that pressure in a way I couldn't control. And control, by then, was the architecture I'd built my entire life around. But the guardianship papers changed something. The discovery that Richard had considered taking Daniel, had retained lawyers, had drafted petitions, had filed a photograph of my son in the same drawer where he kept quarterly earnings reports, had cracked the seal on a compartment I'd welded shut after the eviction. And what leaked out wasn't just anger or determination. It was something older, the original wound, the grief I'd postponed because grieving and planning couldn't occupy the same space, and I'd chosen planning because planning felt like motion and grief felt like drowning. I drove to the cemetery on a Saturday morning in January. The sky was the color of wet newsprint. The temperature was 34 degrees, cold enough for the ground to be hard, warm enough that the frost on the headstones was melting into droplets that ran down the engraved letters like tears the stone was shedding on everyone else's behalf. James's plot was in the newer section, near a Japanese maple that was bare in winter but would, I imagine, provide shade in summer. His headstone was granite, gray, modest. The inscription read what inscriptions always read: name, dates, a phrase chosen in extremis by a woman too deep in shock to be original, beloved husband and father. I stood in front of it and felt nothing. That was the worst part. Not the wave of grief I'd feared, not the flooding, But the absence, the realization that I had spent 5 years converting my love for this man into fuel for a campaign against his brother, and somewhere in that conversion, the raw material had been consumed. What remained wasn't grief or love, but a kind of operational seriousness, a regard for James that was more like a soldier's regard for the cause they fight for than a woman's regard for the man she married. I sat down on the ground in front of the headstone. The grass was frozen and brittle. My jeans would be wet within minutes. I didn't care. I found something in Richard's office, I said. My voice sounded strange outdoors, smaller, more exposed, stripped of the acoustics of rooms and corridors that shaped and contained it. Here, the words traveled a few feet and dissolved into the January air. He was going to take Daniel. He had lawyers, papers, a photo of Danny at school, taken from a car. I paused. He was keeping it as an option, like a reserve play, something he could escalate to if I became a problem. A bird landed on the Japanese maple and pecked at the bark. The sound was sharp and rhythmic, a metronome keeping time I hadn't asked for. I've been buying his debt, James, for 4 years. I have an LLC, Phoenix Holdings. The name felt absurd, spoken out loud to a headstone. I'm at 12% of his total outstanding obligations. I know how much he owes, to whom, at what rates, on what terms. I know his coverage ratios. I know his covenant schedules. I know the names of his lenders and the amounts of his collateral. The granite said nothing. The bird pecked. I'm doing this for Daniel. I need you to know that. Everything I've done, the cleaning, the studying, the purchases, the meals I've skipped, it's for him, to get the house back, to get what's his. But even as I said it, I heard the other truth, the one that lived beneath the stated purpose, like groundwater beneath a foundation. The truth Victor had circled near, the truth that woke me at 3 a.m. and whispered in a voice that sounded too much like my own. This isn't just about Daniel anymore. You're doing this because you need to win, because winning is the only shape your grief knows how to take. I'm afraid I'm becoming someone you wouldn't recognize, I whispered. The cemetery was quiet. The bird left the maple, its wings making a sound like shuffled cards. A distant lawnmower, someone maintaining the grounds, even in winter, droned in a far section like white noise. I stayed for an hour, didn't speak again, just sat with the headstone and the frozen grass and the weight of a conversation that was really a monologue, because the person I most needed to talk to was the one person who couldn't answer. As I was leaving, an old woman appeared on the path that wound through the newer section. She was small, wrapped in a wool coat the color of oatmeal, walking with the careful deliberation of someone managing a body that no longer cooperated with intention. She carried a single flower, a white chrysanthemum, and she moved with the practiced familiarity of a person who had walked this path many times. She sat down on the bench near the end of the row, her husband's grave, I assumed. She placed the chrysanthemum against the headstone with a tenderness that made my chest hurt, the precise, ritualized care of someone who had made this delivery every week for years, possibly decades. I should have kept walking, but something held me, the simplicity of what she was doing. The flower, the bench, the weekly pilgrimage to a man who wasn't there but somehow, through the discipline of return, still was. She looked up at me. Her face was lined and soft and held the particular clarity of a person who had made peace with something most of us spend our lives fighting. "First time back in a while?" she asked. "How did you know? You have the look, guilty and scared." She adjusted the flower against the stone. "My husband died 20 years ago this March. I come every Sunday. Does it help?" She considered this. The lawnmower droned. A cloud moved across the sun, and the light in the cemetery shifted from gray to silver. "It keeps me honest," she said. "When you stop visiting, you start making them into whatever you need them to be instead of who they were." I looked at her, at the flower, at the headstone. Then I looked back at James's grave, 50 yards away, at the inscription I'd chosen in shock, at the stone I'd avoided for 5 years while I turned my husband into a cause instead of a person. beloved husband and father, not a battle flag, not a justification. A man who made pancakes on Saturdays and measured his son's height with an architect's precision and wore a blue tie because I told him it made him look trustworthy. Thank you, I said to the old woman. She nodded, returned to her flour. I walked to the car, got in, sat there. I felt heavier than I had in years, weighted with something I'd been trying to outrun since the funeral. But the weight felt different now, not crushing, clarifying, like ballast in a ship, pulling me lower in the water but keeping me upright. I started the engine. The campaign would continue. The debt purchases, the plan, the invisible war against a man who didn't know he was under siege. But I would come back here every month with a flower or without one. Because the old woman was right, and I owed James more than a strategy. The recession arrived the way recessions always arrive, announced for months, denied for weeks, and then suddenly irrevocably present, like a house guest who'd been standing on the porch the entire time while everyone inside pretended the doorbell hadn't rung. The market contracted in September. By October, credit spreads had widened into chasms. By November, the banks were tightening lending standards with the urgency of surgeons closing a wound, and companies that had operated comfortably on leverage found themselves drowning in debt that had been manageable 3 months ago and was now suffocating. Harrington Consolidated was one of those companies. I watched it happen from 2 vantage points. From the 14th floor, where I cleaned offices that grew tenser by the week, more takeout containers in the trash, more coffee cups left on desks, more lights burning past midnight. And from the financial data I could access through public filings and the secondary debt market, where Harrington's obligations were being sold at steeper and steeper discounts as institutional lenders scrambled to reduce their exposure. The debt I'd been buying at 30 cents on the dollar was now trading at 19. Marcus Webb called me on a Tuesday morning. I was in the studio apartment eating scrambled eggs I'd made from eggs that were 1 day past their sell-by date. Still good, just overlooked by the grocery store's inventory system. Daniel was at school. Clara, I've got something. Marcus's voice had the controlled excitement of a person who dealt in suffering for profit and had learned to modulate his enthusiasm accordingly. A block of Harrington senior debt just hit the market. $62,000 face value, selling at 16 cents on the dollar. 16 cents. That meant I could buy $62,000 of Richard's debt for $9,920. I did the math in my head. My checking account had $2,100. The emergency savings, a term that had become increasingly ironic, held $1,400. Daniel's college $529, which I'd been circling for months like a vulture I was ashamed of, held $11,300. Combined, $14,800. More than enough. But the college fund, Daniel's future, the money James had set aside before he died, automated deposits from a salary earned by a man who believed that preparation was a form of love. Clara, you there? Yes, I'm here. This tranche includes a portion of the secured facility, meaning it's backed by real collateral, not just revenue projections. If Harrington defaults, this paper has teeth. Pleats, the financial market's word for the ability to take what's owed to you. How long do I have to decide? End of day, there are other buyers circling. I hung up, sat at the kitchen counter, looked at the bowl of eggs I was no longer hungry for. The transfer took 20 minutes. Savings account to checking. 529, plan to checking. This required a phone call to the fund administrator, a woman named Patricia who asked me to confirm the withdrawal and state the purpose. Educational expenses, I said, which was a lie that felt like the truth because I was purchasing the most expensive education of my life. I called Marcus at 10:47 a.m. Proceed with the purchase. Full block, $9,920. Confirmed. Phoenix Holdings will hold $62,000 in face value senior secured debt of Harrington Consolidated, effective settlement date 3 business days. When the transaction cleared, I opened the Phoenix Holdings spreadsheet on my phone and updated the total. Phoenix Holdings now owned 31% of Harrington Consolidated's total outstanding debt. 31%. I stared at the number. It was just a number, 2 digits, a symbol, a position in a spreadsheet, but it represented something that numbers alone couldn't capture. 8 years of night shifts, thousands of meals skipped, hundreds of documents photographed, a college fund liquidated, a marriage reduced to a strategy, a life compressed into a single objective. I was the single largest creditor of the company that employed me as a janitor. Victor's response, when I called him that afternoon, was the verbal equivalent of a man watching a controlled demolition from too close a distance. 31%, he said. I could hear him doing math in his head. Clara, do you understand what this means? I understand. You have a blocking position. In any restructuring scenario, nothing happens without your consent. You can approve a plan, reject a plan, or propose your own terms. Richard's lawyers, his banks, his board, none of them can restructure the company's debt without the agreement of the entity holding 31% of it. I know. And that entity is an LLC owned by his dead brother's wife, a woman who mops his floors. The sentence sat between us. Victor said it without drama, but the weight of it was seismic. What's your next move? He asked. I wait, I said. The covenant test is in 4 months. If they fail it, and the math says they will, First Federal triggers the default clause. Harrington has 90 days to restructure or face forced liquidation. And when they come to the table, you'll be sitting at it. Yes, Victor was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I didn't expect. James would be proud of you. I opened my mouth to respond and found that I couldn't, not because I disagreed or because the words didn't land, but because they landed somewhere so deep that the path between that place and my vocal cords was too long for sound to travel. I thanked him, hung up. That evening, Margaret found me in the parking lot of the Harrington building, sitting in my car before the start of shift. She tapped on the window. I rolled it down. She looked at me, at my face, at whatever was written there. You did it, she said. Not a question. I did something, I said. Margaret leaned against the car door, crossed her arms, looked up at the building, 14 floors of glass and steel, lit from within, rising against the evening sky like a monument to the hubris of a man who had mortgaged everything on the assumption that the world would keep being kind to him. You look like a general before a battle, she said. I looked at the building, at the 14th floor where a light was still on. Not before, I said. During. My last night in the Harrington building was a Tuesday in March, 8 years and 4 months after I'd first pushed a mop bucket through its marble lobby. I hadn't planned the timing. The resignation letter I'd written to Nightshine Janitorial was dated 2 weeks earlier, citing personal reasons. But the last shift landed on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate for reasons I couldn't articulate, neither the beginning of the week nor the end, but the middle, the hinge, the point where momentum is already established and stopping requires more effort than continuing. I cleaned the building from the ground floor up, the way I always had. Lobby, second floor offices, the kitchen on 3, conference rooms on 7, the executive suite on 14. Every surface I touched was a surface I was touching for the last time. The awareness gave each motion a weight that cleaning rarely carries. Each swipe of the cloth, each pass of the mop, each emptied trash can was a small farewell to a routine that had defined my life for nearly a decade. I knew this building intimately. I knew that the water fountain on the 5th floor ran warm for the first 3 seconds. I knew that the carpet in the South Conference room had a stain near the window that no amount of treatment could remove. Red wine from a holiday party, according to Margaret, dating back 4 years. I knew that the elevator on the east side drifted slightly left when descending from the 14th floor, requiring an extra push to center the doors. I knew these things the way you know the body of a place you've inhabited, not through information, but through contact, through the physical memory stored in muscles and tendons and the soles of feet that had crossed these floors thousands of times. Richard's office was last. I entered it knowing it was the final time. The room smelled the way it always smelled, leather and cedar cologne, and the particular ozone note of electronics left running overnight. The desk was cluttered, papers, a half-empty coffee mug, the crystal bull paperweight catching the lamp's light. I cleaned it thoroughly, sprayed the desk, wiped the monitor, dusted the credenza, organized the pens in their holder, straightened the photo of Richard shaking hands with the governor. I did not photograph anything. The intelligence gathering phase was over. I had what I needed: years of data, a blocking position in his debt, a legal structure that Victor had reviewed and re-reviewed until it was airtight. There was nothing left to learn from these documents. The map was complete. What remained was the territory. I stood in the center of his office and looked around, at the windows that overlooked a city where I had been invisible, at the desk where I had discovered the truth about his leverage, at the drawer where I had found the guardianship papers, at the carpet I had vacuumed into neat parallel lines every Tuesday and Thursday for 8 years. This room had been my university. Every document left carelessly on its surfaces had been a lecture, every overheard conversation a seminar. Richard paid me $14 an hour to clean his office, and in exchange I had learned enough to acquire 31% of his company's debt from a studio apartment above a laundromat. I turned off the desk lamp, left the room, closed the door. Margaret was waiting by the security desk on the ground floor, leaning against the counter, with the posture of someone who had decided to be present for this particular departure, regardless of whether it was invited. "Last night," she said. "Last night." She looked at me. Years of midnight camaraderie had given our communication a compression that didn't require many words. We had shared protein bars and silences, and the particular trust of 2 women who worked in the dark while the rest of the city slept. "Whatever you're about to do," she said, "make sure it's worth everything you sacrificed." The words were gentle, but they carried the weight of observation, of a woman who had watched me thin out, sharpen, compress myself into the shape of a weapon over the course of 8 years. She wasn't asking whether the plan was sound. She was asking whether the cost had been worth paying. I thought about Daniel's college fund, about the meals I'd skipped, about the years of sleeping 4 hours a night, of living in one room, of watching my son grow up in the peripheral vision of a campaign I couldn't tell him about. I thought about James, about the blue tie, about pancakes on Saturday mornings, about a man who measured his son's height with an architect's precision because he believed that tracking growth was the same thing as participating in it. "It has to be," I said. "There's no version of this where it isn't." Margaret nodded, stepped forward, hugged me, a brief, firm embrace that carried the compression of military bearing and the softness of genuine affection. "Go," she said, "and come back to tell me how it ends." I walked out of the Harrington building at 6:14 a.m. The morning was cold, and the sky was the pale blue of early spring, a blue that promised warmth but hadn't delivered it yet. My cleaning supplies were in a cardboard box in the trunk of my car. My Nightshine ID badge was in my pocket, ready to be returned. I stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the building. 14 floors of glass and steel. Richard's light on the top floor was dark. I had entered this building as a widow with nothing. I was leaving it as the primary creditor of the company it housed. The next phase required different tools. Not a mop and a camera, but a suit and a briefcase and a meeting room and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you hold and exactly what it's worth. I had 18 months of living expenses saved, enough to sustain the apartment and Daniel's needs while the end game played out. Victor had prepared the restructuring proposal. The legal strategy was mapped, annotated, and rehearsed. All that remained was the meeting. I drove home, showered, ate a full breakfast for the first time in months, scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice, a banana. The food sat in my stomach with the unfamiliar weight of adequacy. Then I opened my closet and looked at the suit. I'd bought it 6 months ago at a consignment shop in Summit, a charcoal two-piece, tailored, simple, the kind of suit a woman wears when she wants to be taken seriously without being noticed. It had cost $180, and I'd tried it on once, standing in front of the bathroom mirror in the studio apartment while Daniel was at school, turning left and right, assessing the way it changed the shape of my silhouette, from cleaning woman to someone else, someone Richard would have to look at, someone he couldn't walk past. I hung the suit on the back of the bathroom door and stared at it. Somewhere across town, in a glass tower I'd just left for the last time, the covenant test was 6 weeks away. Richard's team was scrambling, his lawyers were preparing, his banks were circling. And none of them knew about Phoenix Holdings. None of them knew about the woman who had cleaned the 14th floor for 8 years and was now preparing to sit at the table she used to vacuum around. I closed the closet, made Daniel's lunch, peanut butter and banana, crusts removed. Some routines survive revolutions. The night before the meeting, I laid the suit out on the cot where Daniel usually slept. He was at the kitchen counter working on a history essay, his pen moving in the careful strokes of a 16-year-old who had inherited his father's architectural precision and his mother's refusal to do anything halfway. He'd grown tall, 6 feet, James's height, with the lean build of a boy who walked everywhere because his mother's car was unreliable and public transit in Westfield ran on a schedule that bore only a theoretical relationship to reality. His face had sharpened from the soft roundness of childhood into something angular and watchful, a face that was learning year by year to look like James's. I smoothed the suit jacket's lapels, checked the buttons, ran my fingers along the seams, feeling for loose threads. The fabric was good quality. Whoever had donated it to the consignment shop had treated it well, and I'd maintained it with the fastidiousness of a person who owned exactly one suit and understood that it would need to perform a function that bordered on the transformational. "Mom?" I looked up. Daniel had set his pen down and was watching me with the steady, unblinking attention he'd perfected over years of observing a mother who didn't explain things until she was ready. "Where are you going tomorrow?" I'd been preparing for this question, not the answer, the moment. The threshold between the version of this story Daniel knew that we were poor because life was hard, and the version he was about to learn that we were poor because his mother had been fighting a war he couldn't see. "I'm going to a meeting that will change our lives," I said. The sentence landed between us like a stone in still water. Daniel didn't flinch, didn't widen his eyes, didn't ask the cascade of follow-up questions that most 16-year-olds would produce in response to a statement that dramatic. He looked at the suit, at me, at the suit again. "Does this have to do with Uncle Richard?" The question was delivered with the same declarative calm he'd used in his third-grade essay, the one where he'd written that his uncle took things and his dad built them. 8 years later, the clarity hadn't dimmed, it had calcified. "Yes," I said, "and the studying, the late nights?" He gestured at the apartment, at the cot, the kitchenette, the window that overlooked the alley. "The reason we live like this?" "Yes." Daniel was quiet. He turned his pen end over end on the counter, a fidget that James used to do with pencils while processing information. The sound of the pen tapping was soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat being counted. "For how long?" he asked. "Since you were 8? The pen stopped. 8 years, he said, not a question, in accounting. I wanted to tell you sooner, but it's okay, Mom. He said it the way he'd said it the day we moved into this apartment, standing in the center of the room with his backpack on, bouncing on the cot, telling me we'd be fine. The same words, but spoken from a deeper place, with the full weight of a person who had spent his adolescence wondering why his mother was always tired and never home, and had just received an answer that explained everything and nothing at once. You don't have to keep fighting, he said. The words hit me the way certain sounds hit, not through the ears, but through the sternum, a frequency that bypasses cognition and arrives directly at the place where doubt lives. You don't have to keep fighting. He meant it as kindness, as release, as the 16-year-old version of permission to stop, to rest, to choose a life smaller than the one I'd been clawing toward in the dark. He was telling me that he didn't need the house or the money or the vindication. He just needed his mother. And the worst part, the part that kept me awake for the next 6 hours, was that he might have been right. Daniel went to bed at 10. He hugged me before he went, a full embrace, arms around my shoulders, chin on the top of my head because he was taller than me now. He smelled like soap and laundry detergent and the particular clean scent of a teenage boy who hadn't yet learned to use cologne. Good luck tomorrow, he said, whatever it is. I stayed up. The apartment was quiet. The laundromat machines had stopped at 10. The alley outside was dark, except for the security light on the building across the way, which cast a rectangle of white on the wall that moved slightly when the wind pushed the fixture. I sat on the cot, Daniel's cot, which I slept on when he stayed at Aiden's, which tonight I sat on with a suit beside me because my own bed was a futon I'd bought for $40, and it had lost whatever structural integrity it once had. The doubt was enormous, not about the plan. The plan was sound. Victor had verified every element. The legal structure was clean. The financial position was unassailable. 31% of Harrington's outstanding debt held through a properly registered LLC with full documentation of every purchase. When Phoenix Holdings requested a restructuring meeting, Richard's legal team would have no choice but to comply. The doubt was about me, about whether the woman who walked into that boardroom tomorrow would be the person she'd been 8 years ago, a grieving widow trying to protect her son, or the person she'd become, a strategist, a combatant, someone who had learned the language of power by cleaning the floors of the powerful. About whether Daniel was right, whether the fight had consumed more than it could ever return. About whether James, watching from wherever the dead go when the living can't stop speaking their names, would recognize the woman in the charcoal suit. I looked at the suit, the clean lines, the careful stitching, the transformation it promised. Then I looked at my hands. My knuckles were rough from cleaning chemicals. My nails were short. A scar on my right index finger from a broken mop handle 3 years ago. These were a janitor's hands, a mother's hands, a widow's hands. Tomorrow they would sign documents that could collapse a company or rebuild one. I closed my eyes. I didn't sleep, but I rested, which after 8 years felt close enough. The boardroom was on the 14th floor, third door on the left. I had vacuumed it 624 times. I knew the exact dimensions, 32 feet long, 18 feet wide, with a conference table made of reclaimed walnut that seated 16. I knew the carpet pile was Berber, medium density, and that it showed vacuum lines for approximately 4 hours before foot traffic erased them. I knew the windows faced east, and that morning light entered at a 14-degree angle in March, creating a band of warmth across the table that reached chair 7 by 9:45 a.m. I entered the room at 9:30. Victor Asante walked beside me, carrying a leather briefcase that contained 8 years of documentation, compressed into folders organized by year, by transaction, by legal filing. He wore his best suit, the charcoal one he saved for court appearances, and walked with the measured pace of a man who understood that the next hour would determine the trajectory of 2 families and a company. Richard was already there. He sat at the head of the table, his usual seat, the one closest to the window, the one that forced everyone else to look into the light, while he assessed them with the backlighting advantage of a man who understood the theater of positioning. His CFO, Garrett, sat to his right. Two attorneys from Whitaker, Sloan and Associates, flanked them, a man and a woman, both in dark suits, both exuding the practice neutrality of lawyers being billed at $400 an hour to manage someone else's disaster. They were expecting the representative of Phoenix Holdings, LLC, the entity that held 31% of Harrington Consolidated's outstanding debt. The mysterious creditor who had accumulated a blocking position through purchases so small and methodical that no pattern had been detected until the legal notice requesting this meeting had arrived at Richard's office 3 weeks ago. The door opened. I walked in. Richard looked up. His face performed the same sequence I'd witnessed in the hallway 3 years ago: the initial non-recognition, the narrowing of focus, the synaptic cascade of memory and identification, but slower this time, because the context was wrong. I wasn't holding a mop. I wasn't wearing a nightshine uniform. I was wearing a charcoal suit from a consignment shop and walking into his boardroom with a lawyer and a briefcase and the steady, unhurried gait of a person who had been invited. "Hello, Richard." The words dropped into the room like a stone into a frozen lake. The surface held for a moment, a precarious, glassine second of structural integrity, and then the cracks spread. Richard's expression traveled from confusion to recognition to something I had never seen on his face before, the dawning visceral understanding that the ground beneath him had shifted. "Clara?" His voice carried the incredulity of a man whose mental model of the world did not include the possibility of what was happening. What are you doing here?" "I'm representing Phoenix Holdings," I said, "your largest creditor." I sat down, not in the chair near the door where a visitor would sit, not in the middle of the row where a subordinate would wait. I sat in the chair directly opposite Richard, on the far side of the table, at the position that forced him to face me without the advantage of the light. Victor sat beside me, opened his briefcase, arranged the folders on the table with the precise, unhurried movements of a man who had prepared for this moment the way surgeons prepare for procedures, through rehearsal, through visualization, through the elimination of every variable that could be controlled. Richard hadn't moved. His attorneys were exchanging glances, the lateral eye contact of professionals realizing that the situation had deviated from the briefing they'd received. "Phoenix Holdings," Richard repeated. The name sounded different coming from his mouth, smaller, domesticated, stripped of the anonymity that had protected it. "That's you? You're the one who's been buying our debt?" "For 8 years," I said. 8, he stopped, did the math. 8 years ago was the year I'd started cleaning his building, the year after the eviction, the year his dead brother's wife had walked into his lobby with a mop bucket and walked out with his financial secrets. I watched the calculation arrive. The expression that followed was not anger or outrage or indignation. It was something rarer and more dangerous, the recognition of his own blindness. The understanding that the most consequential threat to his empire had been emptying his trash can for nearly a decade, and he had never, not once, looked at her closely enough to see it. He started. "I cleaned your office every Tuesday and Thursday for 8 years, I said. The facts settled the room the way a judge's gavel settles a courtroom, with the authority of things that simply are, regardless of how anyone feels about them. "I mopped the floors you walked on. I dusted the desk you left documents on. I vacuumed the carpet you never looked at." I paused. "And while I did that, I learned your business. Every line of your balance sheet, every term of your credit facility, every covenant and every loan agreement you signed." Garrett, the CFO, had gone very still. He was staring at me with the expression of a man who had just realized that the security breach he'd been investigating for months wasn't a hack or a leak or a rival firm's espionage. It was a cleaning woman with a camera phone and a public library card. One of the Whitaker attorneys, the woman, opened her mouth to speak. Victor raised a hand. Before we proceed, Victor said, we'd like to present our documentation. Phoenix Holdings LLC has made 273 separate purchases of Harrington consolidated debt instruments over a period of 96 months. Each transaction is recorded, time-stamped, and compliant with all applicable securities regulations. The current position represents 31.4% of total outstanding obligations. He opened the first folder and slid it across the table. Richard didn't touch it. He was looking at me. Not at the folder, not at Victor, at me. And in that look, I saw something I had waited 8 years to see. Not fear, though that was there faintly, in the tightness around his eyes. Not anger, though that would come later, predictably the way storms come after pressure drops. What I saw was the thing he had never given me. The thing he had withheld since the funeral, since the manila envelope, since the locks on my front door stopped working. He saw me. For the first time since I became invisible, since grief made me small and poverty made me silent, and his own assumptions made me a piece of furniture in his field of vision, Richard Harrington looked at Clara Harrington and saw a person he needed to take seriously. I held his gaze. "Shall we begin?" I said. The negotiation lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. I know this because the clock on the boardroom wall, a brushed steel analog piece that I'd polished every other Thursday, tracked each minute with the indifference of an instrument that measured time without caring what happened inside it. Victor presented the terms first. He drafted them over 3 months of Saturday meetings, each clause tested against legal precedents and refined through the kind of careful, methodical process that James would have recognized. The same structural patience an architect brings to a blueprint. The deal was this: Phoenix Holdings would not trigger the default clause on Harrington Consolidated's credit facility. This clause, which I had the legal right to invoke, given my position as the holder of 31% of the company's outstanding secured debt, would have required Richard to repay $14.2 million within 90 days, money he didn't have. Money that would have forced liquidation, the end of everything he'd built. In exchange, Richard would agree to 3 conditions. First, the immediate transfer of the residential property at 14 Maple Lane, Westfield, New Jersey, from Harrington Family Holdings back to Clara Harrington, free and clear of all liens and encumbrances. Second, a full accounting of the insurance proceeds from the estate of James T. Harrington, with restitution of all diverted funds to a trust established in the name of Daniel J. Harrington. Third, the restructuring of Harrington Consolidated's debt under terms that included the creation of a beneficial trust naming Daniel J. Harrington as the primary heir to Richard's ownership stake to vest at age 25. Victor read each condition in the same measured tone he used in court. Clear, precise, without inflection. Each sentence was a brick being laid in a structure that had taken 8 years to design. Richard listened. His face moved through phases the way weather moves through a front. The initial shock, then the high pressure of resistance, then the gathering clouds of something more complex. When Victor finished, the room was quiet. Then Richard erupted. "This is extortion." His voice had shifted from the controlled baritone I'd heard for 8 years to something rawer, unprocessed, stripped of the performance he wore like a second suit. "You come into my company, the company I built, and threaten to destroy it unless I give you everything?" "I'm not threatening to destroy it," I said. "I'm offering to save it on terms that are fair." "Fair?" He laughed, a sound that had no humor in it, just the expulsion of pressure. "You stole my financial documents. You took pictures of my files while you were supposed to be mopping my floor. I photographed documents that were left in plain view on unsecured surfaces," Victor interjected, his tone carrying the quiet authority of a man who had anticipated this argument and prepared for it. No locked files were accessed. No computer systems were breached. Mrs. Harrington's intelligence gathering, while unconventional, did not involve any illegal entry, search, or seizure. The Whitaker attorneys exchanged another glance. The woman, who had been silent since Victor raised his hand, was writing rapidly on a legal pad, suggesting she'd already identified the weakness in Richard's position and was calculating damage control rather than defense. Richard turned to me. His tie was loosened. A vein in his temple pulsed visibly, a physical manifestation of blood pressure rising beyond the range that his cardiologist would have approved. "I took care of you," he said. "After James died, I came to your house. I brought documents to make things easier. You stole my home and my husband's insurance money while I was grieving, and you used them as collateral for loans that built this company." My voice was flat, factual, the tone of a balance sheet being read aloud. "You changed your phone number. You had your receptionist turn me away. And when that wasn't enough, you retained lawyers to take my child." The guardianship papers. The words landed in the room like a detonation on a delay fuse, the shock arriving a full second after the sound. Richard's face changed. The anger dimmed. Something else moved behind it. Not remorse. Not exactly, but a recognition. The expression of a man who has been caught, not in a crime, but in a thought. In an intention he'd kept in a drawer and believed no one would ever see. "I never filed those," he said quietly. "I know. You held them, in case I became inconvenient." The room was very still. Richard leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked, a sound I'd heard 1,000 times from the hallway outside, and which now carried a different resonance. He rubbed his face with both hands. The gesture stripped him of a decade of performance. Behind the confidence, behind the charisma, behind the immaculate suits and the calculated handshakes, there was a man, tired, cornered, confronting the architecture of his own choices. When he spoke again, his voice was different, lower, closer to the ground. "James was always better than me." The sentence arrived without context. A confession that had been waiting behind everything else, behind the deals and the leverage and the theft, like a foundation crack that the building had been constructed around rather than repaired. "Our father knew it," Richard continued. "Everyone knew it. James was kind and talented, and people loved him without him trying. And he paused, swallowed. "I spent my entire life trying to build something that would make me feel the way James felt, just standing in a room." I looked at him, at the man who had stolen my home and my money and tried to take my son, at the man who had turned his brother's death into a business opportunity, at the man who sat across from me now, stripped of armor, showing me the wound that had driven everything. I understood it. Understanding and forgiveness are different currencies, and I wasn't ready to spend the latter. But I understood the pain of feeling insufficient, of watching someone you love succeed effortlessly while you strain and calculate and still come up short. James had been the sun. Richard had spent his life building empires in the shadows. "I'm sorry," Richard said. And for the first time in 8 years, I believed him. Not because the words were sincere, sincerity can be performed, but because they came from a man who had nothing left to perform with. "The deal is on the table, Richard," I said. "The house, the accounting, the trust for Daniel. In exchange, Harrington Consolidated survives, restructured, with reduced debt service and a viable path forward. And if I refuse, I trigger the default clause. Your company collapses in 90 days. Your creditors recover what they can from liquidation. You lose everything, including the company, the properties, and whatever is left of your reputation." I paused. "Or you sign. You lose one house, you gain a company that will survive, and your brother's son inherits what should have been his." Richard stared at the folder in front of him. at the pages Victor had laid out, at the terms of a deal written by a woman who had learned corporate finance from library books and built a creditor position from a janitor's salary. He picked up the pen. It was silver, monogrammed with his initials. The same pen he'd given me 8 years ago at my kitchen table to sign away my home. He didn't know that, but I did. He signed, page after page, his hand moving in the deliberate strokes of a man who understood that each signature was a door closing. When he finished, he set the pen down and pushed the folder toward Victor without looking at it. "We're done," he said. Victor collected the documents, confirmed the signatures, exchanged copies with the Whitaker attorneys who had been silent for the duration, professionals recognizing the outcome before it arrived and conserving their energy for the aftermath. I stood, buttoned my jacket. Richard didn't stand. He sat in his chair at the head of the table, in the room he'd built with stolen money, and looked at me with an expression I would carry for the rest of my life. The expression of a man who had finally been defeated by the person he most underestimated. "Was it worth it?" he asked. "Ask me when Daniel moves in," I said. I walked out of the boardroom, past the hallway I'd mopped, past the elevator I'd ridden at dawn, past the lobby I'd entered for the first time as a cleaning woman and was leaving for the last time as something else entirely. Victor held the door. The morning air hit my face, cold, clean, carrying the mineral scent of recent rain and the faint diesel of a bus idling at the corner. I stepped onto the sidewalk. And for the first time in 8 years, I didn't look up at the building. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 40 minutes. The engine was off. The key was in the ignition. My hands were on the steering wheel. At 10 and 2, the position they'd assumed automatically, as though preparing for a drive I hadn't started. Above me, 14 floors of glass and steel rose into a sky that had cleared from gray to the pale, washed blue of early spring. The building I'd cleaned, the building I'd conquered. I had won. The documents were signed. Victor was upstairs with the Whitaker attorneys, finalizing the transfer paperwork. Within 30 days, the deed to 14 Maple Lane would be in my name. Within 60, the insurance restitution would fund Daniel's trust. Within 90, the corporate restructuring would be filed with the court, and Harrington Consolidated would emerge as a smaller, leaner company with my son's name attached to its future. I had won, so why did I feel like I'd swallowed a stone? The hollow feeling had arrived somewhere between the boardroom and the elevator, a spreading blankness, like the silence after a concert ends. For 8 years, every cell in my body had been oriented toward a single point. This meeting, this moment, this victory. And now that the moment had passed, the orientation was gone. The compass needle was spinning. I loosened my grip on the steering wheel. My fingers were white at the knuckles. I looked at them, the same hands that had held a mop, held Daniel's hand, held library books open at 2 in the morning. The same hands that had photographed documents and signed LLC papers and 30 minutes ago had rested on a boardroom table while a man signed away his brother's stolen legacy. These hands had done what I needed them to do. I didn't know what they were for now. I drove to Maple Lane. The house was on the east side of the street, halfway down the block, shaded by the oak tree that had been there since before we moved in. The neighborhood was the same: manicured lawns, sprinkler heads, mailboxes in deliberate rows, but it had the quality of a place seen through glass that distorts the edges slightly, familiar and foreign, mine and not mine. The tenants Richard had placed in the house had vacated per the terms of the agreement. The driveway was empty, the lawn was trimmed but impersonal, the work of a service, not a resident. The mailbox James had painted green was now a standard black, the original color buried under layers of someone else's preference. I sat in the driveway. Then I got out. The front step still had the crack. The same crack James had been meaning to fix the year Daniel was born, and the year after that, until the unfixed crack became a feature of the house rather than a flaw, a shared joke, a minor rebellion against the perfectionism of an architect who could design buildings that stood for decades but couldn't manage to repair a 4-inch fracture in his own front step. I stepped over it. The key, a new one provided by Victor, who had arranged for the locks to be changed that morning, turned smoothly. The door opened into a house I hadn't entered in 8 years. The foyer was empty. The walls were painted a color I didn't recognize, a warm beige that the previous tenants had chosen, covering the pale blue Clara and James had picked from a sample strip at the hardware store in 2012, arguing pleasantly about whether harbor mist or morning sky better described the shade they both already knew they wanted. I walked through the rooms, living room, kitchen, the half bath under the stairs. Each space was stripped to its architectural bones, bare floors, bare walls, bare windows. The furniture was gone, the curtains were gone. The evidence of the people who'd lived here between our departure and this return was limited to scuff marks on the hardwood, picture hook holes in the drywall, and the faint, unplaceable scent of strangers. The kitchen was smaller than I remembered. The counter where I'd signed Richard's documents, where I'd sat in grief and let him take everything, was an ordinary countertop, laminate, slightly worn at the edges. Nothing about it suggested the magnitude of what had happened on its surface. That was the thing about places where your life changes. They don't change with you. They remain exactly what they are: countertops, rooms, steps with cracks, while the people inside them are remade by events the architecture doesn't record. I climbed the stairs. Daniel's room was at the end of the hall. His door, which James had painted red when Daniel was 4 because Daniel had requested a red door like a fire station, was now white. The red was underneath, I imagined, layers deep, hidden but present. I opened the door. The room was empty. The closet door was open, showing bare shelves and a single wire hanger. The window overlooked the backyard, the tree Daniel used to climb, the fence he used to straddle while James called him down, the patch of grass where they'd played catch with a foam football that was always slightly deflated. And there, on the doorframe of the closet, half hidden by the door's hinge, were the pencil marks: age 3, age 4, age 5, age 6, age 7, age 8. James's handwriting. Small, neat, precise to the 1/4 inch. The architectural lettering of a father who measured his son's growth because measuring was the same thing as paying attention. Someone had painted over them, the same warm beige that covered everything else. But the pencil marks were deeper than the paint, etched into the wood, not just applied to the surface. They showed through, faintly, like watermarks in paper, like bones beneath skin. I traced them with my finger, age 3, 37 inches. The year Daniel learned to say architect, because James had taught him the word as a bedtime story about building things that lasted. Age 5, 42 inches. The year Daniel drew a picture of the house and James framed it in his office because he said it was the best design he'd ever seen. Age 8, 50 inches. The year James died, the year the measurements stopped, the year someone stole the doorframe and the house and the life that contained them. I stood there for a long time, long enough for the light through the window to shift from mid-morning to early afternoon, the shadow of the tree outside moving across the floor like a clock hand, measuring hours and leaf patterns. I was home. The word felt both true and insufficient. Home is supposed to be a place of safety, of arrival, of rest. But this home was also a monument to 8 years of absence. 8 years of laundromat machines and library books and midnight photographs and meals I didn't eat because every dollar was a weapon and every weapon needed to be part of the arsenal. I had gotten the house back, but the house I'd gotten back was not the house I'd lost. It was the same structure, the same rooms, the same cracked front step, but the family that had filled it was different now. James was dead, Daniel was 16, and the woman standing in the closet doorway tracing pencil marks through layers of someone else's paint was not the woman who'd left. I wiped my eyes, straightened my suit jacket. Then I walked downstairs, locked the front door with the new key, and drove back to the studio apartment on Jefferson Street. There was still work to do, papers to file, a trust to establish, a life to rebuild in a house that would need, among other things, furniture, curtains, and a new coat of paint. But first, I would make Daniel's dinner and tell him we were going home. I brought Daniel to the house on a Saturday afternoon in April, 3 weeks after the signing. The transfer had gone through. The deed was in my name, Clara Harrington, sole owner, free and clear. Victor had handled the filing with the county recorder's office, and the paperwork now occupied a fireproof safe in his office alongside the Phoenix Holding portfolio and the signed restructuring agreement. The legal architecture was complete, but the house was still empty. No furniture, no curtains, no sound beyond the creak of floorboards and the particular whisper that empty rooms produce when air moves through them, a sound like the building itself is breathing. I drove Daniel there without telling him where we were going. He'd asked and I'd said, "You'll see," which was the kind of non-answer that would have irritated him in any other context, but which, today, he accepted with the patience of a teenager who had learned to trust his mother's sense of timing. We turned onto Maple Lane. I watched his face in the rearview mirror. He was looking out the window with the neutral attention of someone watching a neighborhood scroll past. Houses and lawns and driveways, familiar in the generic way that all suburban streets are familiar to anyone who grew up in one. Then his gaze caught on something. The oak tree on the east side of the street, the shape of a roof, a crack in a front step. His face went still. "Mom, yes. Are we?" I pulled into the driveway, turned off the engine. The silence of the car filled with the ambient sounds of the street, a lawn sprinkler somewhere, a dog barking in a yard 2 houses down, the faint mechanical hum of the world continuing to operate around a moment that, for 2 people in a parked car, had stopped. "It's ours," I said. Daniel didn't move. He sat in the back seat with his hands on his knees, staring at the house through the windshield with an expression I had never seen on his face before, a look that held the archaeology of every emotion he'd experienced in this place. Joy and grief and loss and confusion, and the particular unspeakable pain of a child who had been told to leave his home and had spent 8 years wondering why. "How?" he asked. I turned to look at him. My son, 16, tall and lean and watchful. James's eyes, James's angle of concentration. My own stubbornness, refined through adolescence into something that resembled resolve. "The meeting," I said, "the one I went to, with Uncle Richard." "Yes." A pause. The sprinkler next door cycled through its arc. The water made a sound like gentle applause. "You bought his debt," Daniel said. I blinked. "I pay attention, Mom." His voice was quiet, not accusatory, not proud, just factual, the same tone he'd used in the 3rd grade essay. "I've been watching you study for 8 years. I saw the books, corporate finance, debt markets. I saw the spreadsheets on your phone when you thought I was asleep." The air in the car felt thin, as though the oxygen had been replaced by something denser, the weight of a secret shared after years of containment. "I didn't put it all together until recently," he continued. "But when you said you were going to a meeting with Uncle Richard about something that would change our lives, He paused. "I did the math." He'd done the math. The son of an architect and a self-taught financial strategist had watched his mother fight a silent war for 8 years and had, with the quiet perceptiveness he'd inherited from both of them, assembled the pieces into a picture that was close enough to the truth to make my throat close. "You did this," he said, "all of this, while you were cleaning his floors." The sentence broke something in me, not because it was news. I'd lived every minute of the 8 years he was describing, but because hearing it from his mouth, in his voice, with his father's cadence, transformed it from a thing I had done into a thing someone else could see. The invisible war, rendered visible by the one person whose opinion had driven every sacrifice, every skipped meal, every midnight hour spent studying instead of sleeping. Yes, I said. My voice was rough at the edges. I did. Daniel opened his door, got out, walked to the front of the car, and stood facing the house. I got out too, stood beside him. The house was unchanged from my last visit, empty, quiet, stripped of everything except its structure and the pencil marks hidden under someone else's paint. The crack in the front step, the tree in the backyard that he used to climb. Daniel looked at me, then he hugged me, not the quick, performative embrace of a teenager fulfilling a social obligation. A real hug, arms around my shoulders, his chin on the top of my head, his body leaning into mine with the full weight of a person who was choosing in that moment to hold nothing back. I felt his chest expand with a breath, felt his hands grip the back of my jacket, felt the specific, irreproducible warmth of being held by someone you would die for, who had just communicated without words that they understood what you'd done and why. I cried, not the controlled, strategic tears I'd learned to deploy when grief required a momentary release. Not the quiet weeping of the shower or the parking lot or the 3 a.m. hours when the apartment was dark and the machines below had stopped. I cried the way you cry when the thing you've been carrying for 8 years is finally set down. Messy, loud, with sounds I didn't recognize coming from my own chest. Sounds that had been compressed for so long they emerged distorted, like audio played back at the wrong speed. Daniel held me through all of it. He didn't shush me, didn't say it was okay, didn't offer the comfortable platitudes that people reach for when someone else's grief becomes visible. He just held on. When I stopped, when the sound subsided and the breathing evened out and the world reassembled itself around the two of us standing in a driveway on Maple Lane, he pulled back and looked at me with his father's eyes. "Can we go inside?" he asked. I gave him the key. He opened the front door, stepped over the crack, walked into the empty foyer, and stood there, turning slowly, taking in the bare walls and the hardwood floors and the light that came through the windows in the same angles it had always come through. Because the sun doesn't care who lives in a house, only that the windows are clean. Daniel walked through every room, the kitchen, the living room, the upstairs hallway, his old room at the end of the hall, the door now white instead of red. He opened the closet, found the pencil marks. "Dad," he said quietly. He touched the marks the same way I had, tracing the numbers, the dates, the architectural lettering that measured a boy's growth with an exactness that was, in the end, the most precise expression of love James had ever produced. Margaret arrived that evening. She pulled up in her pickup truck, carrying a bottle of wine, cheap, screw-top, the kind sold at gas stations, and a bag of takeout from the Chinese place on Route 22. We sat on the floor of the living room, no furniture, no table, just the hardwood and the evening light, and 3 people who had, in their own ways, survived something together. Margaret poured the wine into paper cups. Daniel had soda. "To the Phoenix," Margaret said, raising her cup. "To Dad," Daniel said. I raised my cup, drank. The wine was terrible and perfect. We ate lo mein from cardboard containers and talked about nothing important. Margaret's cat, Daniel's electromagnet project, the crack in the front step that would eventually need to be fixed. Outside, the oak tree cast shadows across the lawn as the sun went down. The sprinkler next door had stopped. The neighborhood settled into the quiet hum of evening, televisions and kitchen sounds, and the distant laughter of somebody else's children. I sat on the floor of my house and held my paper cup and listened to my son laugh at something Margaret said about her cat's refusal to use the litter box. 8 years. This is what 8 years felt like when they were over. 3 weeks after we moved in, I sat at James's desk and wrote a letter to Daniel. The desk had been returned with the house. It was built into the alcove of the small office on the ground floor, a custom piece James had designed himself. Walnut, with clean lines and hidden drawers that only opened when you pressed the right part of the molding. An architect's desk, built for a man who believed that function should be invisible and beauty should be structural. The house was taking shape around us. New furniture, modest, second-hand, chosen with the practical eye of a woman who had spent 8 years mastering the art of making less look like enough. Daniel's room had a proper bed now, and he'd repainted his door red the day after we moved in, standing on a stepladder with a roller and a can of semi-gloss from the hardware store, restoring the fire station entrance he'd requested at age 4. The pencil marks on the closet doorframe had been carefully uncovered. I'd used a chemical stripper to remove the beige paint layer by layer, until James's handwriting emerged from underneath like an archaeological find. Clear, precise, undamaged by time or tenants or the layers of other people's lives that had accumulated on top of them. Age 3, age 4, age 5, age 6, age 7, age 8. I'd added a new one, age 16, 68 inches. My handwriting was different from James's, less precise, less architectural, but it belonged on the same doorframe. It was a continuation of the same measurement, the same act of attention. The letter was something I'd been composing in my head for months, possibly years, assembling it in the margins of spreadsheets and the silence between debt purchases. Not a confession, not a justification, a letter from a mother to a son explaining why their life had looked the way it did. I wrote it by hand, no computer, no typewriter, just a pen and paper, the way important things should be committed, with the physical evidence of a hand that shook slightly on certain sentences and pressed harder on others. Dear Daniel, I'm writing this for you to read when you're 25, the age at which the trust vests, and you'll formally inherit your share of the company your uncle built and your father's money funded. By then, you'll have finished college, which despite everything, I am going to make sure happens. You'll be old enough to understand not just what I did, but why. Here is why. When your father died, I lost the person who made the world make sense. James was not a complicated man, which is the highest compliment I can give to anyone, because the world generates enough complexity without individuals adding to it. He built things. He measured things. He loved us in the specific, daily, unspectacular way that matters more than grand gestures. He made pancakes on Saturday mornings because he believed that routine was a form of devotion. When Richard took our home, I lost the last physical proof that your father's love had been real. The house, the insurance, the door frame with your height marked on it, those were the artifacts of a life. And when they were taken, I felt as though the life itself had been retroactively erased. As though James's death wasn't enough. The evidence of his living had to be removed too. I know now that this isn't true. The evidence of your father's life is you, your height, your handwriting, the way you tilt your head when you're thinking, the way you measure things twice before committing. You are the architecture James left behind, and no document or holding company can transfer that away. But I didn't know that then. Then I only knew rage and grief, and the only shape those feelings could take was a plan. The plan consumed 8 years of our lives. 8 years of one room, of skipped meals, of library books and midnight studying, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from fighting a war no one else can see. I made choices during those years that cost us both. Your college fund, your childhood's normalcy, the hundreds of evenings I should have spent with you instead of with a spreadsheet. I want you to understand something about those choices. They were mine, not yours. You didn't ask me to fight Richard, you asked me to stop. And the fact that I didn't, the fact that I chose the plan over your direct, honest 16-year-old request to let it go, is something I'll carry for the rest of my life. I tell you this not because I regret the outcome. The house is ours, the trust is yours. The company your uncle built on stolen money will, through the restructuring, generate the security your father would have wanted for you. I tell you this because I want you to understand the cost. Because the world will teach you, is already teaching you, that strength looks like persistence, that justice looks like winning, that the right thing and the hard thing are always the same thing. And sometimes they are, but sometimes the hardest thing is knowing when to stop. I didn't know when to stop. I couldn't. The plan became the point. The plan became the shape my grief took when it couldn't be grief anymore because grief was too painful and planning was productive. And by the time I realized that the plan had consumed more than it could return, I was too deep to climb out. You can learn from that. Or you can make the same mistake in a different shape. That's the luxury and the curse of being someone's child. You inherit both the blueprints and the flaws. Here is what I know, Daniel. After 8 years of invisible war, the quietest battles are fought by the people no one sees. The cleaning women and the night shift workers and the mothers who skip meals so their children can eat. They fight without recognition, without applause, without the satisfaction of anyone else knowing the scale of what they've endured. They fight because the alternative is surrender, and surrender is a luxury that people with children cannot afford. But the cost of those battles is real, and the person who pays it most is often the person the battle was fought for. I fought for you. Everything I did, the mop, the books, the midnight phone calls to a debt broker named Marcus Webb, was for you. But I also fought for me. For the version of myself that needed to prove that the woman Richard dismissed was not the woman she appeared to be. That the widow with the mop was as dangerous as the man with the briefcase. That invisibility could be a weapon instead of a sentence. Both of those truths are real. And I want you to hold them both without choosing between them. Love always. Mom. I folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, wrote on the front, "For Daniel, open at 25. Then I placed the envelope in the hidden drawer of James's desk, the one that opened when you pressed the right part of the molding, and closed it. The drawer sealed with a sound like a whisper. I sat at the desk for a long time. The afternoon light came through the office window and laid rectangles of gold on the floor. From upstairs, I could hear Daniel's music, something with bass and syncopation, the soundtrack of a teenager reclaiming a bedroom that had been taken from him at 8 and returned at 16. The house was full of sounds again, not the sounds of before. Those were gone, sealed away with James's voice and the particular pitch of a 4-year-old requesting a red door. But new sounds. A boy becoming a man, his footsteps heavier than they used to be, his music louder, his presence larger. The house held us the way houses hold everyone. Temporarily, imperfectly, with walls that can't contain what happens inside them but try anyway. I opened the desk's main drawer. Inside was a blueprint, one of James's, rolled and tied with a rubber band. I didn't unroll it. Didn't need to. I knew what it was, the plans for this house, drafted before we moved in, annotated in his handwriting with measurements and load calculations and a note in the margin that read simply, "For Clara and Danny." I touched the roll of paper, felt the weight of it, the potential energy of a drawing that had become a building, that had become a home, that had been taken and recovered and would now finally be lived in again. "For Clara and Danny," I whispered. He'd built well, the foundation held. The morning was early and the light was gold. I stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, the same window that had turned the room amber every evening when James was alive, though I hadn't remembered that detail until we moved back in and the first sunset proved that the light had been waiting all these years for someone to stand in it again. Outside, Maple Lane was waking up, sprinklers activated on timers. A neighbor's car backed out of a driveway with the cautious reverence of someone who had not yet consumed enough caffeine to trust their depth perception. A dog, The golden retriever from 2 doors down trotted along the sidewalk with the self-possessed authority of a creature who owned the block and tolerated the humans who happened to live on it. Daniel came downstairs at 7:15. He was 17 now. The growth spurt of the past year had taken him past 6 feet, and he moved through the house with the careful proportionality of someone still adjusting to a body that had recently expanded. His backpack was slung over one shoulder, heavy with textbooks, a laptop, and a scientific calculator that he used the way James had used a drafting pencil, as a thinking tool, an extension of cognition. He was wearing the white sneakers I'd bought him for his 12th birthday. They were too small now. He had new ones, properly fitted, but he wore the old ones around the house the way some people keep a lucky charm, sentimental without being sentimental about it. "Morning, Mom, morning." He opened the refrigerator, poured orange juice, pulled a banana from the bunch on the counter. The movements were automatic, domestic, unremarkable, the choreography of a morning routine performed by a person who had a home, who knew where the glasses were kept, who reached for things without looking because their location had been committed to the same muscle memory that governs breathing. 5 years ago, this routine took place in a studio apartment above a laundromat. The glasses were plastic. The orange juice was store brand. The banana, if there was one, was shared. Now the glasses were from a set I'd bought at the outlet store in Summit. The orange juice was still store brand. Some habits survive prosperity, and I had learned during the lean years that brand names were a tax on the assumption that more expensive things tasted better, which they did not. The banana was from a bunch I'd picked up at the farmer's market on Route 22, where a vendor with calloused hands sold fruit that tasted the way fruit is supposed to taste before supply chains optimized the flavor out of it. Small things. The architecture of a rebuilt life, assembled from hundreds of small decisions that together formed something that felt, from the outside, like normalcy. Daniel finished his juice, set the glass in the sink. "I've got a calc test second period," he said. "And the science fair presentation is tomorrow. Can I stay at Aiden's after school to practice? Be home by 8. Deal." He shouldered his backpack, leaned down because he was taller than me now, and kissed the top of my head. A quick daily gesture that he'd started doing after we moved back in, unprompted, unannounced, as though some part of him had decided that physical affection was a language he wanted to speak more fluently. "Bye, Mom. Bye, sweetheart." He walked through the foyer, stepped over the crack in the front step, still there, still unfixed, now elevated from minor annoyance to family monument. The door closed behind him with the solid thud of a well-built entry in a well-built house. I watched him walk down Maple Lane. His stride was long and unhurried. James's walk, the same pace, the same quiet confidence that came not from arrogance, but from the simple fact of being at home in his own body. His backpack bounced slightly with each step. His breath made small clouds in the morning air. He turned the corner at Highland Avenue, disappeared behind the neighbor's oak tree. I took a sip of coffee, watched the street settle back into its morning rhythm. The dog completed its circuit and returned to its yard. The sprinklers continued their arcs. The sun climbed above the roofline of the house across the street and sent a column of light through the kitchen window that landed, as it always had, on the counter where I stood. My phone buzzed, a notification from the brokerage account linked to Phoenix Holdings. I glanced at it. The daily portfolio summary, a habit I maintain the way soldiers maintain their gear long after the deployment ends. Harrington Consolidated, restructured, deleveraged, renamed Harrington Trust Holdings in the reorganization filing, had posted its first profitable quarter. Revenue was up 6%, debt service coverage ratio, 1.84. The trust established in Daniel's name had grown by $14,200 in the past 90 days. The numbers were good, the company was healthy. The foundation Richard had built on stolen money had been demolished and rebuilt on terms that were honest, structured by a woman who had learned corporate finance from library books and built a creditor position from a janitor's salary and the proceeds of a liquidated college fund. Daniel's college fund, incidentally, had been replenished. The insurance restitution Victor had negotiated covered the full amount and then some. Daniel would attend whatever school he chose, study whatever field compelled him, and do so without the shadow of financial anxiety that had defined every year of his childhood from 8 to 16. I closed the app, slipped the phone into my pocket. The kitchen was quiet. The house was quiet. The particular quality of silence that a well-built structure produces, not absence of sound, but the absorption of it. The walls and floors and ceilings doing what James had designed them to do, containing life, providing shelter, standing firm. I poured a second cup of coffee, set it on the counter, opened the window. The morning air came in, cool, carrying the mineral scent of dew on asphalt and the green chlorophyll freshness of grass that had been cut the day before. Below the window, the garden bed James had planted the spring Daniel was born held the first shoots of something I'd planted last weekend. Tulips, maybe, or hyacinths. I'd bought the bulbs without reading the label, which was a kind of surrender to uncertainty that the woman who'd built Phoenix Holdings would never have permitted. But that woman was evolving, becoming someone who could plant bulbs without knowing what would grow. Someone who could stand at a kitchen window and feel the morning air and not immediately calculate what it meant or what it cost or how it served the plan, because the plan was finished, the war was over, and what remained was this: a house on a quiet street, a son walking to school, coffee in a cup that caught the morning light, the ordinary, unremarkable, staggering miracle of a life that had been broken and rebuilt and was now improbably being lived. I leaned against the counter, felt the warmth of the sun through the window, the same warmth that had been falling through this glass for decades, patient and indiscriminate, arriving every morning regardless of who stood beneath it. "We made it, James," I whispered. The words dissolved into the kitchen air, into the walls he'd designed, into the foundation he'd built. Outside, the morning continued. The dog barked once, a car passed, the sprinklers turned. The world went on, as it always does, paying no attention to the quiet victories of the people who hold it together. I drank my coffee, and for the first time in 8 years, I didn't have anywhere I needed to be.